The old house stood silent and imposing, its countless rooms and corridors a maze of possibilities for the 4 Pevensey children who had been sent there to escape the war in London. Rain drummed against the windows, forcing them indoors on what seemed like another dreary afternoon of forced entertainment. Lucy, the youngest of the siblings, watched as her older sister Susan attempted to organize yet another indoor game, while Peter and Edmund bickered over the rules. "We could play hide and seek," Lucy suggested softly, her voice barely carrying over her brother's argument. To her surprise, Peter immediately seized upon the idea, perhaps more to end the brewing conflict than out of genuine enthusiasm. "Splendid idea, Lou," he declared, already beginning to count. 1, 2, 3. As her siblings scattered, Lucy ran through the unfamiliar hallways, her footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Door after door proved disappointing, filled with dusty furniture or simply too obvious as hiding places. Then she found it. A room containing nothing but a massive wardrobe, its wooden surface intricately carved with strange symbols and patterns. Have you ever had that feeling when something ordinary suddenly seems extraordinary? That's exactly what Lucy felt as she approached the wardrobe. The air around it seemed to shimmer with possibility. Without hesitation, she pulled open the heavy door and stepped inside, leaving it slightly ajar, for Lucy was a sensible girl who knew better than to shut herself in a wardrobe. As she pushed deeper through the hanging coats, expecting to feel the solid wooden back at any moment, something extraordinary happened. Instead of smooth wood, her searching fingers found sharp, prickly pine needles. The musty smell of mothballs gave way to the crisp scent of winter air, and the darkness transformed into a strange, silvery light. But how can there be light in a wardrobe? You might ask, just as Lucy asked herself. The answer revealed itself as she took one more step forward and found herself standing in a snow-covered forest, with delicate flakes drifting down from an overcast sky. Lucy gasped, her breath visible in the cold air. The wardrobe had vanished behind her, replaced by more trees stretching as far as she could see. In the distance, a warm golden light flickered through the snowfall. As she approached, the light revealed itself to be coming from an old-fashioned lamppost, standing alone in the woods like a sentinel from another world. But Lucy wasn't alone for long. The crunch of footsteps in the snow made her turn, and there she saw one of the most peculiar sights imaginable. A creature that was half man and half goat, carrying several brown paper packages and an umbrella. This was Mr. Tumnus, though Lucy didn't know it yet. The fawn was just as startled to see her as she was to see him, dropping his packages in surprise. "Goodness gracious me," he exclaimed, scrambling to collect his scattered parcels. What would you do if you met a fawn in a snowy wood? Lucy, being both kind and curious, immediately moved to help him. "Please, let me help you with those," she said, gathering the packages. Mr. Tumnus studied her with a mixture of wonder and concern. "Thank you, but if you don't mind my asking, are you a daughter of Eve?" Lucy's brow furrowed in confusion. "My name is Lucy," she replied simply. This seemingly straightforward exchange marked the beginning of something extraordinary. Mr. Tumnus invited Lucy to tea, and despite the little voice in her head that reminded her not to go with strangers, something about the fawn's gentle manner and kind eyes made her trust him. As they walked his cave home, Lucy learned that this magical land was called Narnia, though it was not the Narnia it should have been. The endless winter, Mr. Tumnus explained with a touch of sadness, was the work of the White Witch, who had claimed the throne for herself and forbidden the celebration of Christmas. Inside his cozy cave, with a cheerful fire crackling and tea brewing, Lucy couldn't help but feel she had stumbled upon something more significant than a simple adventure. But what she didn't yet realize was that her discovery would set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the fate of an entire world. What Lucy also couldn't know was that at that very moment, as she sat listening to Mr. Tumnus play his strange pipe-like instrument, dark forces were already aware of her presence in Narnia. The White Witch had eyes everywhere, and the arrival of a human child was exactly what she had been dreading and preparing for a very long time. But for now, Lucy simply enjoyed her tea and sardines with her new friend. unaware that her siblings wouldn't believe her tale when she returned, or that her next visit to Narnia would lead to consequences both wonderful and terrible. After all, isn't that how the best adventures begin? With a simple choice to step through a door into the unknown. The gentle crunch of snow beneath their feet gradually faded as Lucy followed Mr. Tumnus into his cozy cave dwelling. The warmth from the crackling fireplace immediately embraced her, such a stark contrast to the perpetual winter outside. Have you ever experienced that wonderful feeling of coming in from the cold? That's exactly how Lucy felt at that moment. "Do make yourself comfortable, daughter of Eve," Mr. Tumnus said, gesturing to a well-worn armchair that seemed to have been made just for someone Lucy's size. "I'll put the kettle on for tea." His hooves clicked against the stone floor as he bustled about his small but charming home. Lucy's eyes wandered around the cave, taking in every detail. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with titles she'd never heard of before: The Life and Letters of Silenus, Nymphs and Their Ways, and Is Man a Myth? She couldn't help but wonder what stories these mysterious books held. What tales did fauns read about? As Mr. Tumnus prepared the tea, his hands trembled slightly, though Lucy didn't notice at first. He arranged sardines on toast, a honey-drizzled cake, and sugar-dusted biscuits on a tray. But something was troubling the faun. A weight seemed to rest upon his shoulders that had nothing to do with the tea service he carried. "Tell me, Lucy," he said, pouring tea into delicate cups, "what is it like in your world?" "The world of humans." His voice carried a note of desperate curiosity, but also something else. Was it guilt? Lucy happily chatted about her home, her siblings, and the war that had sent them to the countryside. As she spoke, Mr. Tumnus grew increasingly distressed, though he tried to hide it behind his teacup. What could be causing such anxiety in this gentle creature? "And what about winter?" he asked suddenly. "Does it last forever there too?" "Forever?" Lucy laughed. "Of course not. We have spring, summer, and autumn too. Don't you have those here in Narnia?" The faun's face fell, and he set down his cup with shaking hands. "Not anymore," he whispered. "Not since she came." She. Lucy leaned forward, curious, but also slightly worried by her new friend's obvious distress. Mr. Tumnus burst into tears, covering his face with his hands. The sight of the weeping faun made Lucy's heart ache. What could have happened to make him so upset? "Oh, I'm such a terrible faun," he sobbed. "I don't suppose there ever was a worse faun since the beginning of time." Lucy, being the kind-hearted girl she was, immediately moved to comfort him, offering her little handkerchief. "Whatever do you mean, Mr. Tumnus? You're the nicest faun I've ever met." Of course, she had never met any other fauns, but that hardly seemed important at the moment. Through his tears, Mr. Tumnus revealed the terrible truth. He was in the service of the White Witch, Jadis, who had commanded all Narnians to capture any human they encountered. "She's the one who makes it always winter," he explained, his voice heavy with shame. "Never Christmas, always winter. She rules Narnia through fear and cold." Lucy's eyes widened as she realized the danger she was in, but instead of fear, she felt compassion for the clearly tormented faun. "Is that why you invited me for tea?" To which she couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes," Mr. Tumnus admitted miserably, "but I can't do it. I can't give you up to her, don't you see? I'm kidnapping you. That's what I am. I serve the White Witch. I'm meant to put you to sleep and take you to her." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavier than the winter snow outside. But what would Mr. Tumnus choose? His duty to the feared White Witch, or his newfound friendship with this daughter of Eve? In that moment, as the fire crackled and the tea grew cold, both Lucy and Mr. Tumnus faced a crucial decision that would affect not only their own fates, but potentially the future of Narnia itself. Would friendship triumph over fear? Could one small act of kindness begin to break the spell of endless winter? The faun looked at Lucy through tear-stained eyes, his internal struggle visible on his face. What would you do if you were in his position? Would you choose friendship over duty, safety over what's right? As the moments ticked by, the weight of the decision seemed to press down on them both, while outside, the eternal winter continued its cold reign over Narnia. But sometimes, the warmest acts of courage can bloom even in the coldest of winters, and the smallest choices can lead to the greatest adventures. What choice would Mr. Tumnus make? And how would his decision affect not only Lucy's fate, but the destiny of Narnia itself? The answers to these questions would soon unfold, but first, a choice had to be made. One that would echo through the halls of Narnia's history forever. Lucy burst through the wardrobe, her heart racing with excitement, and her mind filled with wonderful memories of her afternoon tea with Mr. Tumnus. The warmth of his cave and the delightful taste of sardines on toast still lingered in her thoughts. But as she ran through the spare room, she realized something peculiar. No time had passed in her world. How could that be possible? Peter, Susan, Edmund, you'll never believe what just happened. Lucy called out, her voice echoing through the old professor's house. She found her siblings exactly where she'd left them, still contemplating their game of hide and seek. "Found you at last, Lou," Peter said with a grin. Though that wasn't much of a hiding spot if you're just going to shout about it. Lucy's excitement bubbled over as she began recounting her extraordinary adventure. "But I've been gone for hours. I went through the wardrobe and found a magical land called Narnia. Everything was covered in snow, and I met the most wonderful faun named Mr. Tumnus." Susan's practical nature immediately surfaced. "Don't be silly, Lucy. You've only been gone for a few moments. We were just about to start looking for you." "But it's true," Lucy insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a whole other world in there. The wardrobe is magical. You have to believe me." Edmund, seeing an opportunity to tease his younger sister, smirked. "A magical wardrobe. Come off it, Lucy. Next thing you'll tell us is that you had tea with a talking rabbit." "Not a rabbit, a faun. And yes, we did have tea with sardines and cake," and Lucy's voice trailed off as she noticed the skeptical looks on her siblings' faces. Have you ever felt that sinking feeling when nobody believes something you know to be true? Peter, trying to be the responsible older brother, approached the wardrobe with Lucy. "All right, Lou, show us this magical land of yours." They opened the heavy wooden door, pushing past the fur coats, but their hands met only the solid wooden back of the wardrobe. Lucy's heart dropped to her stomach. But it was here. I swear it was here," she stammered, pushing deeper into the coats. The snow, the lamppost, Mr. Tumnus. They were all here. Susan placed a gentle hand on Lucy's shoulder. "Lucy, it's just your imagination. There's nothing wrong with that, but you must learn to distinguish between what's real and what's pretend." Tears welled up in Lucy's eyes. How could she make them understand? The warmth of Mr. Tumnus's fire had been real. The sound of his flute had been real. The guilt in his eyes when he confessed his allegiance to the White Witch had been real, hadn't it? As evening approached, the tension among the Pevensey siblings grew. Lucy refused to admit she had made it all up, while the others became increasingly frustrated with what they saw as their sister's stubborn attachment to a childish fantasy. Have you ever known something with absolute certainty, only to have everyone around you insist you were wrong? That night, as Lucy lay in her bed, she could hear her siblings whispering in the hallway. "Do you think we should tell the professor?" Susan's worried voice carried through the door. "And say what?" Peter responded. "That Lucy's gone mad over a wardrobe." Edmund's voice joined in, unusually serious. "Maybe she's just lonely. It can't be easy being the youngest." Lucy pulled her blanket over her head, trying to block out their voices. She knew what she had experienced was real, but doubt began to creep into her mind like the winter frost she had seen in Narnia. What if they were right? What if it had all been a dream? But then she remembered Mr. Tumnus's tearful confession, the weight of the White Witch's tyranny that hung over Narnia, and the warmth of friendship she had found in that magical land. No, it couldn't have been just her imagination. But how could she prove it to her siblings? As sleep finally began to overtake her, Lucy wondered if she would ever find her way back to Narnia. Would Mr. Tumnus be safe from the White Witch? And most importantly, would her siblings ever believe her? Little did she know that her adventures in Narnia were far from over, and that soon, one of her siblings would discover the truth of her tales in the most unexpected way. What would you do if you discovered something magical and wonderful, but no one believed you? Would you keep trying to prove it, or would you keep it as your own special secret? As Lucy drifted off to sleep, these questions weighed heavily on her mind, setting the stage for events that would test not only her conviction, but also the bonds between the Pevensey siblings. The crisp winter air nipped at Edmund's face as he followed Lucy through the wardrobe, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. Could his little sister's fantastic tales actually be true? The soft fur coats gave way to something cold and wet. Snow. Edmund's eyes widened as he realized he was standing in a snow-covered forest, the impossible becoming reality before him. Lucy, he called out, his voice echoing through the silent woods, but his sister was nowhere to be seen. Instead of the warm reunion he expected, Edmund found himself alone in this strange frozen world. What would Peter and Susan say if they could see this? Would they finally believe Lucy's stories? As Edmund wandered through the snow-laden forest, the jingling of bells caught his attention. A magnificent sleigh appeared through the swirling snowflakes, drawn by white reindeer. Upon it sat a tall, beautiful woman dressed in white furs, her face both enchanting and somehow terrible to behold. This was Jadis, the White Witch, though Edmund didn't know it yet. "And what, pray tell, are you?" she asked, her voice as cold as the winter air around them. Edmund, shivering both from cold and nervousness, replied, "I'm Edmund. I'm a boy." The White Witch's eyes gleamed with interest. Here was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. "A son of Adam?" she questioned, her voice suddenly honey-sweet. "You must be cold, dear boy. Come, sit with me." What harm could there be in accepting her invitation? Edmund thought to himself as he climbed into her sleigh. The witch wrapped him in her furs, and with a wave of her wand, produced a hot drink that warmed him to his core. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked, conjuring a box of Turkish delight. The magical candy was more delicious than anything Edmund had ever tasted, each piece more addictive than the last. As he ate, the witch asked him questions about his family, particularly about his siblings. Edmund, his mouth full of Turkish delight, told her everything. "I would love to meet your family, Edmund," the witch said smoothly. "Especially your brother and sisters. I could make you a prince, you know. And when you're king, you could have rooms full of Turkish delight." The promise of power and endless sweets clouded Edmund's judgment. But wasn't there something Lucy had said about a witch? A warning, perhaps? The thought slipped away as quickly as it came, dissolved by the sweetness of Turkish delight and the witch's haunted words. "All you need to do is bring your siblings to my castle," she continued, pointing to a distant structure between two hills. "You can find it easily. It's between those two hills. Would you do that for me, dear Edmund?" Edmund nodded eagerly, his mouth still full of Turkish delight. What could be wrong with introducing his siblings to such a kind and generous queen? Surely they would thank him for it. As the Turkish delight's enchantment took hold, Edmund failed to notice the cruel smile that played across the witch's face. She had found her weapon against the prophecy. A traitor from within. How easy it had been to manipulate this young son of Adam with nothing more than sweets and empty promises. When Edmund finally found Lucy again, she was bursting with excitement about seeing Mr. Tumnus. But Edmund barely heard her words, his mind consumed with thoughts of more Turkish delight and the promise of becoming a prince. Would he really betray his siblings for the sake of sweets and power? The question nagged at him, but the enchantment of the White Witch's Turkish delight was strong. Back in the real world, Peter and Susan remained skeptical of their siblings' tales. But Edmund, still under the influence of the witch's magic, denied ever being in Narnia at all. The hurt in Lucy's eyes was evident, but Edmund pushed aside his guilt, telling himself it would all be worth it once he was king. Little did Edmund know that his moment of weakness would set in motion a chain of events that would test not only his loyalty to his family, but the very fate of Narnia itself. As night fell in the professor's house, Edmund lay awake, his dreams filled with Turkish delight and icy castles, while the shadow of betrayal loomed ever closer. What price would Edmund ultimately pay for his temptation? And could the bonds of family survive such a betrayal? As the enchanted Turkish delight worked its dark magic, these questions would soon find their answers in ways none of the Pevensey children could have imagined. The crisp sound of snow crunching beneath their feet echoed through the silent forest as Lucy, Peter, Susan, and Edmund stepped through the wardrobe into Narnia. The familiar sensation of fur coats giving way to snow-laden branches welcomed them, but this time they were all together. Lucy's heart swelled with vindication. Finally, her siblings could see what she had been trying to tell them all along. "I can't believe it," Susan whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. "You were right all along, Lucy." She reached out to touch a nearby ice-covered branch, a practical nature struggling to accept the magical reality before her. Peter, ever the protective older brother, surveyed their surroundings with cautious wonder. "It's exactly as you described it, Lou. But why is it so cold?" He pulled his coat tighter around himself, his leadership instincts already kicking in as he assessed their situation. Lucy, however, noticed something different in Edmund's demeanor. He seemed unusually quiet, his eyes darting nervously around the snow-covered landscape. Was he remembering his encounter with the White Witch? What secrets was he keeping from them? "We should go visit Mr. Tumnus," Lucy exclaimed, eager to introduce her siblings to her first Narnian friend. "He'll know what to do, and he makes the most wonderful tea with sardines and cake." As they trudged through the deep snow, the siblings began to understand the true extent of the eternal winter. The forest stood frozen in time, its branches heavy with ice that never melted, its streams frozen solid. But why was it always winter? What power could hold an entire land in such a frozen grip? "Lucy," Peter asked, breaking the eerie silence, "has it always been winter here?" Before Lucy could answer, a distant wolf's howl pierced the air, causing them all to freeze in their tracks. Edmund's face turned particularly pale, and Susan grabbed Peter's arm instinctively. "The White Witch," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Tumnus told me she's the one who made it always winter, but never Christmas. She's ruled Narnia for 100 years. The mention of the White Witch caused Edmund to fidget uncomfortably, drawing suspicious glances from Susan. What was it about the witch that affected him so? The weight of his secret encounter with her pressed heavily on his conscience. As they approached Mr. Tumnus's cave dwelling, Lucy's excitement turned to dread. The door hung off its hinges, and icicles formed a menacing barrier across the entrance. Inside, the once cozy home lay in ruins, furniture overturned, books scattered, and a thin layer of snow covering everything. Who would do such a thing? Susan gasped, picking up a torn book from the floor. Lucy's eyes fell upon a document nailed to the wall, its official seal gleaming ominously in the dim light. Peter approached it, reading aloud. "The former occupant of these premises, the Faun Tumnus, is under arrest and awaiting trial on charges of high treason against Her Imperial Majesty Jedis, Queen of Narnia, for comforting her enemies and fraternizing with humans." The words hung heavy in the frozen air. Lucy's eyes filled with tears as she realized her friend had been arrested because of her. "We have to help him," she pleaded, looking at her siblings with determination. Edmund shifted uncomfortably, knowing more than he was willing to share. The Turkish delight's sweetness had turned bitter in his memory, but the White Witch's promises still echoed in his mind. Would his siblings ever forgive him if they knew? A new sound caught their attention, the tinkling of bells in the distance. Peter ushered everyone behind a snow-covered boulder, their hearts pounding. Was it the White Witch's sleigh? Would they be discovered and meet the same fate as Mr. Tumnus? But fate had other plans. Instead of the dreaded witch, they encountered Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. It would become their crucial allies in the events to come. The Beavers spoke of an ancient prophecy about 4 human children who would end the witch's reign and restore peace to Narnia. When Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done, Mr. Beaver recited solemnly. Could these ordinary children from Finchley really be the ones destined to break the witch's winter? As they huddled in the growing darkness, listening to tales of Aslan and ancient prophecies, Each sibling grappled with their own doubts and fears. The eternal winter suddenly felt more oppressive than ever, but with it came a spark of hope. Something was stirring in Narnia. The ice was beginning to crack, literally and metaphorically. But what trials awaited them on their journey? Would they find Mr. Tumnus? And most importantly, could they trust each other with the challenges ahead? As night fell over the frozen landscape, none of them could have predicted how their adventures would test their bonds as siblings, their courage as individuals, and their faith in each other. The winter's grip on Narnia was strong, but perhaps the arrival of 4 children from another world would finally begin to thaw its frozen heart. The warmth of the beaver's cozy dam provided a stark contrast to the biting cold of Narnia's eternal winter. As Lucy, Peter, Susan, and Edmund huddled around the roughly hewn wooden table, Mrs. Beaver busied herself preparing hot tea and toast, while Mr. Beaver cleared his throat, preparing to share a tale that would change their understanding of Narnia forever. "You see, children," Mr. Beaver began, his whiskers twitching with excitement, "your arrival here isn't just by chance. There's a prophecy, old as Narnia itself." The siblings leaned forward, their eyes wide with curiosity. Even Edmund, who had been unusually quiet since their arrival, couldn't help but listen intently. Lucy's voice trembled with anticipation as she asked, "What kind of prophecy, Mr. Beaver?" The steam from her teacup swirled in the air, creating mysterious patterns that seemed to dance with the words of the ancient prediction. Mr. Beaver's voice took on a solemn tone as he recited, "When Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done." But what does it mean? Susan questioned, her practical nature seeking clear answers. Mrs. Beaver, who had joined them at the table, exchanged knowing looks with her husband. "It means," Mrs. Beaver explained gently, "that 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve, that's your 4, will defeat the White Witch and restore peace to Narnia." The weight of this revelation settled over the children like a heavy blanket. Peter, feeling the responsibility of being the eldest, spoke up. "But how could we possibly defeat someone powerful enough to keep an entire land in eternal winter?" This question hung in the air, giving voice to the fears they all shared. It was then that Mr. Beaver mentioned a name that would fill their hearts with both hope and awe: Aslan. The mere mention of the name sent a curious sensation through the room. Lucy felt a warmth in her heart, while Peter experienced a surge of courage. Susan's doubts seemed to momentarily fade, and even Edmund appeared affected, though he tried to hide it. "Who is Aslan?" Lucy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Beaver's eyes sparkled as he replied, "Aslan is the true king of Narnia. He's not a man, but a great lion, the son of the emperor beyond the sea. They say he's on the move, that he's returning to Narnia after a long absence." As the Beavers continued their tale, they spoke of how Aslan would help them fulfill the prophecy, how he had the power to defeat the White Witch, and how he would restore spring to Narnia. They described his wisdom, his power, and his goodness, painting a picture of hope that seemed to warm the very air around them. But amidst this conversation, none noticed Edmund quietly slipping away from the table, his mind clouded with thoughts of Turkish delight and the White Witch's promises. The others were too engrossed in the Beaver's tales of Aslan's might and the prophecy's significance to notice his absence immediately. The Beavers shared stories of the Golden Age they believed would come once the prophecy was fulfilled, a time when Narnia would flourish under the rule of 4 human monarchs. They spoke of Cair Paravel, the magnificent castle by the eastern sea where the 4 thrones awaited their rightful occupants. As the evening progressed, Lucy found herself asking more and more questions about Aslan. But if he's so powerful, why hasn't he stopped the White Witch before now? Mr. Beaver's response was thoughtful. "Aslan works in his own time, in his own way. Everything happens when it's meant to happen, including your arrival in Narnia." It was only when Mrs. Beaver began preparing a proper dinner that Susan noticed the unusual quiet from her younger brother's corner. "Where's Edmund?" she asked, her voice cutting through the warm atmosphere like a cold wind. The sudden realization of Edmund's absence brought a chill to the room that had nothing to do with the winter outside. Peter rose quickly from his chair, his face pale with concern. When did anyone last see him? The answer to that question would lead them into their next challenge, one that would test their courage and faith in the prophecy they had just learned about. But for now, the warmth of the beavers' home was replaced by a growing sense of urgency and fear for their brother's safety. What had Edmund done? Where had he gone? And more importantly, what would this mean for the prophecy that seemed to rest on all four of them being together? As these questions raced through their minds, they couldn't help but wonder if they were truly ready for the destiny that awaited them in this magical land. The warmth of the beavers' dam had created a false sense of security, but in the depths of that snowy night, darkness crept into young Edmund's heart. While his siblings listened intently to Mr. Beaver's tales of Aslan and the prophecy, Edmund's mind wandered to the sweet taste of Turkish delight and the promises of power that the White Witch had planted in his thoughts. But how can we be sure this Aslan will help us? Edmund had interrupted earlier, his voice carrying an edge that Lucy noticed but couldn't quite understand. The question hung in the air, heavy with doubt that only Edmund truly felt. As the night grew deeper and the others drifted into conversation about their role in saving Narnia, Edmund's chair slowly emptied. His absence went unnoticed at first, masked by the excitement of revelation and hope that filled the cozy dam. It was Lucy who first sensed something amiss, her special connection to Narnia making her more attuned to the shifting energies around them. "Where's Edmund?" she asked, a small voice cutting through the animated discussion. The question dropped like a stone into still water, creating ripples of concern that spread across every face in the room. Peter jumped to his feet, his elder brother instincts kicking in. "Edmund," he called out, already moving toward the door. Susan followed, her practical nature immediately assessing the situation. "He was here just a moment ago," Mrs. Beaver fretted, wringing her paws. "Oh dear, oh dear." Outside, Edmund's footprints in the snow told a story that broke Lucy's heart. They led away from the dam, toward the direction they all feared, the witch's castle. The bitter wind carried flurries of snow, already beginning to erase the evidence of his betrayal. "I should have watched him more carefully," Peter muttered, his voice thick with regret. "I knew something was wrong when he returned from his first visit to Narnia, but I didn't want to believe." Susan placed a gentle hand on Peter's shoulder. "We all should have seen it. The White Witch must have done something to him during their first meeting." Meanwhile, Edmund trudged through the snow-laden forest, each step taking him further from his family and closer to the glittering ice castle that seemed to beckon him forward. The Turkish delight's enchantment still lingered in his mind, but there was something else too. A desire to be more than just the younger brother, to be someone of importance. What Edmund didn't realize was that importance comes in many forms, and the path he was choosing would lead to consequences that would shape not only his fate, but the fate of all Narnia. As he approached the witch's domain, the wolves that guarded her castle emerged from the shadows, their yellow eyes gleaming with malicious welcome. Back at the beaver's dam, a plan was quickly forming. "We must reach Aslan's camp before the witch finds us," Mr. Beaver declared urgently. "If Edmund has gone to her, we're all in danger." Lucy's eyes filled with tears as she thought of her brother alone in the dark with the White Witch. "But we can't just leave Edmund," she pleaded, her voice trembling with emotion. "My dear," Mrs. Beaver said gently, "your brother has chosen his path for now, but that doesn't mean all is lost. Aslan has a way of turning even the darkest betrayals into opportunities for redemption." The group hurriedly gathered supplies, knowing that their journey had suddenly become more urgent. The cozy safety of the dam would soon be replaced by a desperate race against time. As they prepared to leave, Lucy caught a glimpse of the two moons in Narnia through the window, their light somehow dimmer than before, as if they too mourned Edmund's choice. What would the White Witch do when Edmund arrived? Would they be able to reach Aslan before it was too late? And most importantly, could Edmund find his way back from this betrayal? Or had the White Witch's magic already claimed him completely? The night grew colder as two journeys continued in opposite directions. Edmund toward the witch's castle, and his siblings toward their destiny with Aslan. The prophecy of four thrones at Cair Paravel now hung by a thread, and the fate of Narnia balanced precariously on the choices of one confused young boy who had yet to understand the true meaning of power and loyalty. As they stepped out into the snowy night, Peter looked back one last time in the direction his brother had gone. "We'll find you, Edmund," he whispered into the darkness. "Whatever it takes, we'll bring you home." But even as he made this promise, the howling of wolves in the distance reminded them all that time was running out, and the real battle for Narnia, and for Edmund's soul, was only just beginning. The bitter winter wind howled through the trees as Lucy, Peter, and Susan followed the beavers through the snow-laden forest. The revelation of Edmund's betrayal still hung heavy in their hearts. Each step they took weighted with worry for their brother and fear of what lay ahead. "We must hurry." Mrs. Beaver called out, her usually cheerful voice now urgent and strained. "The witch's wolves won't be far behind." Lucy's small feet struggled through the deep snow, her mind racing with questions. "But what about Edmund? We can't just leave him," she pleaded, tears freezing on her cheeks in the harsh cold. Peter turned to his youngest sister, his face a mixture of determination and pain. "Lucy, we don't have a choice right now. The best way to help Edmund is to reach Aslan." He reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Remember what Mr. Beaver told us about the prophecy." Susan, ever practical, kept glancing behind them as they moved. "Listen," she whispered suddenly, bringing the group to a halt. In the distance, the haunting howls of the witch's wolves echoed through the darkness. "They're getting closer," Mr. Beaver warned, his whiskers twitching nervously. "We need to find shelter, and quick." The group pressed on, their breath coming in white puffs in the freezing air. Lucy couldn't help but wonder. Would they ever see Edmund again? What was happening to him at the witch's castle? The thought of her brother alone with that terrible woman made her heart ache. Mrs. Beaver led them to a hidden cave, cleverly concealed behind a curtain of icicles. "In here, quickly," she urged, ushering them inside. The cave was tight, but offered protection from both the bitter cold and searching eyes. As they huddled together, trying to catch their breath, Susan voiced what they were all thinking. "What if the wolves track our scent?" "That's why we need to keep moving," Mr. Beaver explained, already planning their next move. "But first, we need to rest and gather our strength. The journey to Aslan's camp is long, and we'll need all our energy." Peter pulled his sisters close, trying to warn them. "Do you remember when we used to play hide and seek back home?" he asked, attempting to lift their spirits. "This is just like that, only this time we're hiding from real monsters," Lucy finished, her voice small but brave. The howls grew closer, sending shivers down their spines that had nothing to do with the cold. Mrs. Beaver pulled out some food from her little pack, passing around small portions. "Eat up, dears. We'll need our strength." As they ate in tense silence, Lucy remembered Mr. Tumnus and his warm cave, the tea and sardines, and how different everything had seemed then. "Will we ever have peace in Narnia?" she wondered aloud. Peter wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "That's why we're here, Lou. The prophecy speaks of 4 thrones at Caer Paravel. We have to believe in that in Aslan." "But what about the prophecy now?" Susan questioned, her logical mind working through the problem. "It speaks of 4 thrones and Edmund." Mr. Beaver interrupted firmly. "Aslan has a way of making things right. Don't lose hope, especially now." A sudden noise outside made them all freeze. The wolves were near, their paws crunching in the snow, their breathing audible even through the cave walls. The children held their breath, hearts pounding so loud they feared it might give them away. "When I give the signal," Mr. Beaver whispered, barely audible, "we'll make a run for it. There's a tunnel at the back of this cave that leads to the river. If we can cross it, we'll have a better chance of losing them." Lucy gripped Peter's hand tighter, thinking of Edmund again. Was he safe? Did he regret his choice? And most importantly, would they ever be together again as a family? The prophecy had brought them to Narnia, but now it seemed to be falling apart around them. The wolves' voices could be heard now, speaking in low, menacing tones as they searched the area. The children pressed themselves against the cold cave wall, trying to become as small, and quiet as possible. Each second felt like an hour as they waited, hoping the wolves would pass by. Mrs. Beaver touched each of their hands in turn, offering silent comfort. In the darkness, Lucy could see Peter's determined expression, Susan's calculating gaze, and the beaver's unwavering courage. They were all afraid, but they were together, and somehow that made it bearable. The sound of the wolves began to fade, moving away from their hiding place. But they all knew this was just the beginning of their journey. Ahead lay many more challenges, crossing the frozen river, finding Aslan's camp, and somehow finding a way to save Edmund from the White Witch's clutches. What would happen when they'd finally reached Aslan? Could the great lion really help them save their brother? And even if they did rescue Edmund, could they fulfill the prophecy and bring spring back to Narnia? These questions swirled in their minds as they prepared for the next phase of their desperate flight to safety. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling meadow as Lucy, Peter, and Susan, along with the beavers, finally caught their first glimpse of Aslan's camp. Their hearts, heavy with worry for Edmund, found a moment of relief at the sight of countless red and gold tents dotting the landscape. The gentle spring breeze carried the sound of centaurs' hooves, the melodic conversations of talking animals, and the metallic clink of weapons being forged. Is this really where Aslan is? Lucy whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The very air seemed different here, filled with the kind of energy that made their exhaustion from the long journey fade away. Mr. Beaver nodded solemnly. Indeed it is, little one. But remember, he's not a tame lion. Mrs. Beaver squeezed his paw, both of them sharing a knowing look that made the children wonder what exactly they meant. As they approached the camp, a magnificent centaur named Orius stepped forward to greet them. "Welcome, sons of Adam and daughters of Eve," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "We have been expecting you." The words sent a shiver down Peter's spine. How had they known they were coming? The camp was unlike anything the children had ever seen. Fauns practiced their archery, while dryads danced through the trees, their leafy forms shimmering in the sunlight. A group of talking animals, including a particularly verbose hedgehog, were discussing battle strategies with a sullen-looking centaur. But it was the stone table that drew their attention. Standing atop a hill overlooking the camp, the ancient stone structure seemed to pulse with an energy that was both terrifying and fascinating. "What is that?" Susan asked, her practical nature seeking to understand this mysterious landmark. A wise-looking fox approached them, bowing slightly. "That, my queen, is the stone table. It's been here since the dawn of Narnia itself. They say that the deep magic is written on it in letters older than the stars themselves." "Deep magic?" Peter questioned, his hand unconsciously tightening on his sword hilt. The fox was about to respond when a hush fell over the entire camp. The air grew still, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. "Aslan," Lucy whispered, and somehow they all knew she was right before they even turned to look. There he stood, more magnificent than any of them had imagined. His golden mane caught the sunlight, and his eyes held wisdom that seemed to span centuries. The great lion's presence filled the clearing with a warmth that was both comforting and awe-inspiring. "Welcome, children of Adam and Eve." Aslan's voice resonated through them, not just in their ears, but in their very souls. But where is the fourth? The question brought their worries about Edmund crashing back. Peter stepped forward, trying to find the right words to explain their brother's betrayal without condemning him entirely. He's been captured by the White Witch Aslan. She tricked him. A shadow of sadness passed across Aslan's face, but there was something else there too. Determination, perhaps. "We shall speak of Edmund later," he said. "For now, you must rest and prepare. The stone table will play its part in what is to come, though perhaps not in the way any of you expect." As the children were led to their tents, Lucy couldn't help but look back at the stone table. Something about it called to her, like a half-remembered dream. "Susan," she whispered to her sister, "do you feel it too? Like the stone table has a story it's trying to tell us." Susan, usually so practical, nodded slowly. "Yes, but I'm not sure I want to know what that story is." That night, As the camp settled into an uneasy sleep, the stone table stood silent under the stars. But those who listened closely might have heard the ancient stones whispering of sacrifice, of deeper magic, and of a love stronger than death itself. What secrets did the stone table hold? What role would it play in their quest to save Edmund and defeat the White Witch? And why did Aslan's eyes hold such sorrow when he looked upon it? The answers would come, but they would shake the very foundations of Narnia itself. The children drifted off to sleep, their dreams filled with images of the great lion and the mysterious table, unaware that they were about to witness one of the most significant moments in Narnian history. The stone table's true purpose would soon be revealed, and with it, a demonstration of the deepest magic of all, the power of sacrificial love. The crisp night air hung heavy with anticipation as Peter, Susan, and Lucy huddled with Aslan in his tent, their hearts racing with concern for their brother Edmund. The great lion's mane seemed to glow in the dim lamplight as he outlined their desperate rescue mission. But how can we be sure Edmund is still alive? Susan's voice trembled, speaking the fear they all shared. Aslan's deep, resonant voice filled the tent with warmth and hope. The White Witch keeps her prisoners alive for a purpose, dear one. We must act swiftly, but not rashly. Peter gripped the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white with determination. I should have protected him better. I'm his older brother. It was my responsibility. Lucy reached out and touched his arm. We all share that responsibility, Peter. Remember what Mr. Tumnus told us about the witch's power to deceive. The mention of their fawn friend brought a momentary silence as they recalled his own imprisonment and brave sacrifice. The rescue party was assembled quickly, with Reepicheep insisting on leading the advanced scout team despite his small size. Size matters not in matters of courage, Your Majesties, the noble mouse declared, his tail twitching with anticipation. I can slip through shadows where others cannot tread. Trumpkin, loading his bow with arrows, nodded in agreement. The mouse speaks truth. We need stealth as much as strength tonight. The rescue party moved through the darkness like shadows, guided by Aslan's wisdom and the intelligence gathered by their woodland allies. The White Witch's castle loomed before them, its ice walls gleaming menacingly in the moonlight. But what horrors awaited them inside? Lucy couldn't help but wonder if they would find the brother they knew, or if the witch's influence had changed him forever. She remembered Edmund's face when he first tasted the Turkish delight, how the magic had seemed to cloud his judgment and twist his loyalty. The rescue operation unfolded in stages, with Reepicheep's team creating diversion at the castle's main gate. The sound of chaos erupted as the witch's wolf guards howled in confusion, drawn away from their posts by the clever mouse's tactics. Meanwhile, Peter led a smaller group, including Susan and several centaurs, through a lesser-known entrance discovered by their spies. The ice corridors seemed endless, each turn bringing new dangers and the constant fear of discovery. Look, Susan whispered, pointing to a set of frozen footprints in the floor. These are fresh. They followed the trail, their hearts pounding with each step. The dungeon level was a maze of ice cells, each one containing shadows that could be their brother. Lucy clutched her healing cordial, praying she wouldn't need to use it. When they finally found Edmund, the sight broke their hearts. He was chained to an ice wall, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes still held a spark of defiance. The moment he saw his siblings, tears began to fall, freezing on his cheeks in the bitter cold. I'm sorry, he managed to whisper as Peter worked to break his chains. I was so foolish. Lucy hugged him fiercely. What matters is that you're alive and you're coming home. But their reunion was cut short by the sound of approaching guards. The rescue party had to move quickly, with Edmund barely able to walk. Peter carried his brother on his back as they made their desperate escape, with Susan providing covering fire with her bow. Trumpkin proved invaluable, his knowledge of siege warfare helping them navigate the castle's defenses. But as they neared their escape route, they'd heard the White Witch's enraged scream echo through the halls. Would they make it out before she caught them? The tension mounted as they raced through the castle, with Edmund growing stronger with each passing moment away from the witch's influence. The group's coordination was perfect, with Reepicheep's diversion team rejoining them at precisely the right moment to cover their retreat. As they finally reached the safety of the forest, Edmund looked back at the castle that had been his prison. "She'll come for me, won't she?" he asked quietly. Aslan, who had been waiting at the forest's edge, stepped forward. "She will try, son of Adam, but you are under my protection now." The rescue had succeeded, but all knew this was just the beginning. The White Witch would not let this insult go unanswered, and war seemed inevitable. As they made their way back to Aslan's camp, each member of the party wondered, what price would they have to pay for Edmund's freedom? Lucy watched her brother as they walked, noting how he seemed to stand taller with each step away from the witch's domain. Could this ordeal have changed him for the better? And what role would he play in the coming battle for Narnia's future? The night's success brought both joy and apprehension to their hearts. Edmund was safe, but the real test of their courage and unity was yet to come. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, they realized that their adventure was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The air hung heavy with tension as Aslan and the White Witch stood facing each other on the great stone table. The Pevensey children watched from a distance, their hearts pounding with fear for Edmund's fate. Lucy clutched Susan's hand tightly, while Peter stood protectively near Edmund, who couldn't bring himself to meet anyone's eyes. "You know the deep magic, Aslan?" Jadis's voice cut through the silence like ice. "Every traitor belongs to me. That boy's blood is my property." Her long pale fingers pointed accusingly at Edmund, who seemed to shrink further into himself. Peter stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword. "You can't have him. He's our brother." But Aslan's low growl stopped him in his tracks. "Peace, son of Adam." Aslan's voice resonated with authority and wisdom. The White Witch speaks of laws that were written before time itself. His golden eyes held a depth of knowledge that made even Jadis pause. Lucy's small voice trembled as she asked, "But Aslan, isn't there anything we can do?" The great lion turned to her with eyes full of compassion, reminding her of why she had trusted him from the very beginning. The White Witch's cruel smile widened. "Do you really think your simple human love can override the deep magic, the laws that govern Narnia itself?" She circled the stone table, her ice blue gown trailing behind her. "The boy's treachery demands payment. Or have you forgotten, great Aslan, how Narnia itself was built on these fundamental laws?" Mr. Tumnus, who had been standing quietly among the gathered creatures, stepped forward. "But surely there must be mercy in these ancient laws." His hooves clicked nervously on the stone as he spoke. "Mercy." Jadis laughed, the sound echoing like breaking icicles. "Was there mercy when this boy betrayed his own family for Turkish delight? When he willingly gave up their secrets to me?" Edmund finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The weight of his actions pressed heavily upon him, and tears began to form in his eyes. Susan, always the practical one, trying to reason. "There must be something in these laws, some alternative we haven't considered." She looked pleadingly at Aslan, hoping his wisdom would provide a solution. The great lion's expression remained unreadable as he said, "Come, Jadis, let us speak privately." The two powerful beings moved away from the gathering, their voices too low for anyone to hear. What could Aslan be proposing? What secrets lay within the deep magic that could save Edmund? The tension mounted as minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Reepicheep, the valiant mouse warrior, stood tall despite his small stature. "Whatever happens, young king," he addressed Edmund, "know that true redemption lies not in our past actions, but in how we choose to move forward." Trumpkin nodded in agreement. The deep magic may be ancient, but so is the power of transformation. Perhaps that's what Aslan understands better than any of us. The waiting seemed endless. Peter paced nervously, while Susan tried to comfort Lucy, who couldn't stop watching the distant figures of Aslan and the witch. Edmund sat alone, lost in thoughts of regret and hope. Finally, Aslan and Jadis returned. The witch's expression was triumphant, yet there was something unsettling in her victory. Aslan's face showed no defeat, only a deep, knowing sadness that made Lucy's heart ache. "The boy will live," Aslan announced, his voice carrying across the gathering. A collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. But Lucy noticed something in Aslan's eyes that made her wonder. At what cost had this victory been achieved? The White Witch mounted her chariot, her final words hanging in the air like frost. "Do not think this ends here, sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. The deep magic always demands its price." As she disappeared into the darkness, the Pevensey children rushed to embrace Edmund, their joy mixed with lingering concern. But Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous had just occurred, something beyond their understanding. What price had Aslan agreed to pay? What secrets of the deep magic had been invoked in that private conversation? And most importantly, what consequences would this decision have for all of Narnia? The answers would come soon enough, but for now, in the growing darkness, the siblings held each other close, grateful for Edmund's salvation, yet aware that their journey was far from over. The deep magic had spoken, but its full meaning remained yet to be revealed. The night air hung heavy with an unspeakable sadness as Lucy and Susan secretly followed Aslan through the darkening woods. They had noticed his sullen departure from the camp, and driven by concern, decided to trail behind him. The great lion's usual majestic gait seemed weighted, his golden mane lacking its characteristic luster. What could make such a powerful being appear so burdened? "Do you think we should turn back?" Susan whispered to Lucy, but her younger sister's determined expression answered before words could form. As they crept through the forest, the sisters witnessed something they had never seen before. Aslan's vulnerability. The mighty lion, who had always been their source of strength and wisdom, walked as if carrying the weight of all Narnia on his shoulders. What could possibly trouble someone as powerful as Aslan? Meanwhile, back at the camp, Peter struggled with his own demons. Edmund, now freed from the witch's influence, sat beside his brother, both unable to sleep. "Peter," Edmund spoke softly, "what do you think Aslan discussed with her?" The older brother could only shake his head, the weight of leadership pressing heavily upon him. The scene at the stone table unfolded like a nightmare. Lucy and Susan watched from their hiding place as the White Witch's followers gathered, dark creatures, hags, werewolves, and all manner of evil beings. Their malicious laughter echoed through the night air as Aslan approached the ancient stone structure. Why would he walk willingly into such danger? Chades stood atop the stone table, her face twisted with triumphant cruelty. "The fool comes willingly," she announced to her followers. "The great cat surrenders himself." The truth dawned on the hidden sisters with horrifying clarity. The deep magic required a life for a life. Aslan had traded his own life for Edmund's. The noble lion had chosen sacrifice over safety, love over self-preservation. "Bind him," commanded the witch, and her followers swarmed around Aslan. The great lion offered no resistance as they bound his paws and muzzled him. Lucy had to stifle a cry as she watched their rough treatment of their beloved friend. How could he allow this? Why didn't he fight back? The witch's voice cut through the night air like ice. "You know, Aslan, I'm a little disappointed in you. Did you honestly think you could save the human traitor? You are giving me exactly what I want. Your death will mean the end of Narnia." But Aslan's eyes, even in his moment of helplessness, held no fear. They burned with a knowledge beyond the witch's understanding. What secret did he hold that gave him such peace in the face of death? The horrible ceremony began. The witch raised her stone knife, its cruel edge gleaming in the torchlight. "Tonight, the deep magic will be appeased, but not in the way you hoped, Aslan. In killing you, I destroy Narnia's last hope." Lucy and Susan clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed the unthinkable. The knife fell, and with it, hope seemed to die in Narnia. The great lion lay still upon the stone table, his sacrifice complete. The witch and her followers departed in triumphant celebration, leaving the sisters alone with their grief. They approached Aslan's body, their steps heavy with sorrow. As they untied the ropes that bound him, their tears fell upon his still form. "Why?" Lucy whispered. "Why didn't you tell us?" But even in death, Aslan's face held a serenity that suggested purpose beyond their understanding. The mice of the field came forth, gnawing at the ropes that had bound him, joining the girls in their vigil. What meaning lay behind this sacrifice? What hope could possibly remain? As the sisters sat in their grief, the stars wheeled overhead, and the night grew old. They couldn't bear to leave him alone, not after everything he had done for them, for Edmund, for Narnia. But neither could they shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, that somehow, in some way they couldn't yet understand. Aslan's sacrifice was part of a deeper plan. The question hung in the air, like the morning mist beginning to gather. What power could be greater than death itself? What magic more ancient than the deep magic that demanded the sacrifice? As dawn approached, Lucy and Susan would learn that some questions have answers too wonderful to imagine, and that the greatest magic of all often works in ways we least expect. The first rays of dawn had yet to pierce the darkness when Susan and Lucy huddled together near the stone table, their hearts heavy with grief. They had witnessed something no child should ever have to see, the sacrifice of their beloved friend and protector, Aslan. The great lion's body lay still upon the cold stone, bound by ropes that seemed to mock his former majesty. "I can't bear to look at him like this," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling as she buried her face in Susan's shoulder. The elder sister stroked Lucy's hair, trying to be strong despite her own tears. The events of the previous night played repeatedly in their minds. The cruel laughter of the White Witch, the humiliation of Aslan, and his final moments of dignity even in death. "We should at least untie him," Susan suggested, a practical nature emerging through her sorrow. Together, the sisters approached the stone table, their small hands working to free Aslan's body from the bonds that held him. The ropes were thick and tight, and their fingers grew sore from the effort, but they persisted. As they worked, Lucy couldn't help but wonder, what will happen to Narnia now? What about Peter and Edmund? The thought of their brothers preparing for battle against the White Witch's forces filled them both with dread. Without Aslan, how could they possibly succeed? The mice of the field, drawn by some ancient magic or simple compassion, emerged from their hiding places and began to help, gnawing at the ropes with their sharp teeth. Susan and Lucy watched in amazement as dozens of tiny creatures worked together, reminding them that even in the darkest moments, they were not alone. With the ropes finally removed, the sisters sat beside Aslan's body as the sky began to lighten. The air grew colder, and a strange silence fell over the hilltop. "We should go," Susan said reluctantly. "The others will be wondering where we are." But before they could move, a tremendous crack split the air. The stone table, ancient and powerful, began to break. The sisters scrambled backward, watching in astonishment as the massive stone split down the middle, and Aslan's body disappeared into the growing darkness between the fragments. "Oh no!" Lucy cried out, thinking they had somehow failed to protect even Aslan's body. But then, something extraordinary happened. As the sun crested the horizon, its golden light seemed to gather and concentrate, forming a familiar shape. There, standing before them, his mane glowing like molten gold in the morning light, was Aslan, alive whole, and more magnificent than ever. But how? Susan stammered, her practical mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. "We saw the witch." Aslan's warm laugh rolled across the hillside like summer thunder. "There is a magic deeper than the deep magic the witch knows," he explained. "When a willing victim who has committed no treachery is sacrificed in a traitor's stead, the stone table will crack, and even death itself will turn backward." Lucy's face brightened with joy and understanding. Then Edmund. "Is safe," Aslan confirmed, allowing the young girl to throw her arms around his neck. "The price has been paid, but death itself could not hold its claim when that payment was made in love and willing sacrifice." The implications of this miracle began to dawn on Susan. "But the witch doesn't know," she realized. "She thinks you're dead. She's leading her army against Peter and Edmund right now." "Indeed," Aslan replied, a gleam in his golden eyes. "And that is why we must make haste. But first, climb on my back. We have other friends to gather, and this time, I can feel my strength has doubled." As the sisters climbed onto Aslan's back, holding tight his magnificent mane, they could feel the power thrumming through his body. The sun continued to rise, casting long shadows behind them as they prepared to race against time to save their brothers and all of Narnia. "Hold on tight," Aslan warned, and with a mighty roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world, they began their journey to turn the tide of battle. The dawn's miracle had not only restored Aslan to life, but had also restored hope to Narnia. As they raced across the landscape, Lucy couldn't help but wonder, what other wonders would this day bring? And how would the White Witch react when she discovered that her greatest victory had become her most devastating defeat? The answers to these questions lay ahead, carried forward on the winds of change that were sweeping across Narnia, bringing with them the promise of spring after the long-missed winter. The morning air crackled with tension as Peter stood atop the rocky outcrop, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The gathered army of Narnia stretched before him, centaurs with their gleaming armor, talking beasts with determined expressions, and creatures of all kinds united under one banner. But would it be enough? "Your Majesty," Orius, the centaur general, approached Peter. "The witch's army approaches from the north. They outnumber us 2-1. Edmund, standing beside his brother, exchanged a worried glance with Peter. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on their young shoulders. How strange it seemed that just weeks ago, their greatest concern had been avoiding Mrs. Macready's stern lectures in the professor's house. "Remember what Aslan taught us," Peter said, his voice carrying across the assembled warriors. "We fight not just for Narnia, but for everything good and true in this world. Who among you has not suffered under the witch's endless winter?" A murmur rippled through the army. Trumpkin the dwarf, his red beard catching the morning light, stepped forward. "We've waited 100 years for this day, son of Adam. The prophecy speaks of 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve. Where are your sisters?" Peter's heart clenched, remembering Lucy and Susan's tear-stained faces as they discovered Aslan's body on the stone table. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, something miraculous was happening miles away. "They're with Aslan," Edmund answered, his voice steady. "And that's where they need to be." The sound of horns echoed across the valley, sending a chill through every warrior present. The witch's army had arrived. Through the morning mist, they could see her forces, dark creatures, fallen beasts, and corrupted spirits, all led by Jadis herself, resplendent in her icy armor atop a chariot pulled by polar bears. "Do you think we can win?" a young faun asked, his voice trembling slightly. Peter looked at the creature, reminded so much of Mr. Tumnus, who even now sat in the witch's dungeon as a stone statue. "We must win," he replied. "For Narnia and for Aslan, and for all those who've suffered under her reign." Reepicheep, the valiant mouse warrior, scampered up to Peter's shoulder. "Your Majesty, permit me to lead the first charge. My size may be small, but my heart is as big as any warrior's here." Peter couldn't help but smile at the mouse's courage. "We attack together, Reepicheep. Every creature here, big or small, has a part to play in this battle." The army began to move into position, following the battle plan they'd practiced countless times. Griffin squadrons took to the sky, ready to rain arrows down on the enemy. Centaurs formed the front line, their hooves pawing at the ground in anticipation. The talking beasts, leopards, bears, and wolves loyal to Aslan, gathered in strategic groups. Edmund turned to Peter one last time. "Do you remember what Professor Kirky told us? About how there's always a deeper magic?" Peter nodded, thinking of the strange old professor who had first welcomed them into his home. Had he known what adventures awaited them? "I remember, and I believe in it now more than ever." The witch's voice carried across the battlefield, cold and clear as ice. "Surrender now, son of Adam, and I may spare your army. Aslan is dead, hope is lost. Winter will reign eternal." But Peter knew something the witch didn't. He'd seen the look in Lucy's eyes when she spoke of Aslan, the unwavering faith of Mr. Tumnus, even in his darkest hour, and the transformation in Edmund from betrayer to loyal brother. there was indeed a deeper magic at work. For Narnia, Peter raised his sword, catching the morning sun, and for Aslan, the battlefield erupted in a thunderous roar as the armies charged toward each other. Griffin wings darkened the sky, arrows flew like rain, and the ground trembled beneath thousands of feet, hooves and paws. As Peter led the charge, sword gleaming, he couldn't help but wonder. Where were Lucy and Susan? What had become of Aslan's body? And most importantly, could they truly defeat an enemy who had held Narnia in her icy grip for 100 years? The answers to these questions would come soon enough, but for now, the great battle for Narnia had begun. The fate of an entire world hung in the balance, and at its center stood a boy who had entered this magical land through a wardrobe, now transformed into a leader of armies. The clash of weapons filled the air as the two forces met, and the Battle of Baruna began in earnest. But even as sword met sword and tooth met claw, none could predict the miraculous turn this day would take, for magic deeper than the deep magic itself was already in motion, racing toward them with the speed of hope itself. The battlefield was a chaos of clashing swords and desperate cries when Lucy first spotted the golden figure cresting the eastern hill. Her heart leaped with joy as she recognized the magnificent form of Aslan, his mane catching the morning light like flames. Behind him, an army of freed Narnians poured over the ridge, centaurs with gleaming armor, giant eagles swooping overhead, and countless other creatures who had been turned to stone by the White Witch's magic. "Susan, look!" Lucy called out to her sister, who was nearby tending to a wounded fawn. Susan's eyes widened in wonder, and for a moment, the practical sister allowed herself to smile with pure, childlike joy. The battle had been going poorly for Peter's forces. Edmund had been fighting bravely beside his brother, but the witch's army seemed endless. Reepicheep, despite his small size, had been a whirlwind of valor, his tiny sword finding its mark again and again. But even his incredible courage couldn't turn the tide alone. For Narnia and for Aslan, the great lion's roar echoed across the battlefield, sending shivers through friend and foe alike. The White Witch's face, for the first time, showed real fear. She had thought Aslan dead. How could he be here? But there was no time for questions as the reinforcements crashed into her army's flank. Trumpkin, who had been defending a group of younger animals, let out a whoop of joy. "Now that's what I call perfect timing," he shouted, his red beard bristling with excitement as he renewed his attack with fresh vigor. Mr. Tumnus, who had been fighting near Peter, called out, "The prophecy. Remember the prophecy." His words reminded them all of the ancient prediction that when Aslan was on the move, the witch's power would begin to fail. But would it be enough? The witch was still formidable, her wand turning creatures to stone with each touch. She fought her way toward Peter, determination etched on her cold features. What would happen when she reached him? Edmund, seeing his brother's danger, made a decision that would prove crucial. Remember how he had once betrayed his siblings to the witch? Now was his chance for complete redemption. He fought his way through the melee, focused on one goal, the witch's wand. Meanwhile, Aslan was carving a path through the enemy forces, but he wasn't just fighting. With each breath, he was reversing the witch's magic. Stone statues that had once been brave Narnian warriors were coming back to life, joining the battle with cries of joy and revenge. "Look what's happening to the witch's army," Lucy exclaimed to Susan. Indeed, many of the evil creatures were beginning to flee, their courage failing in the face of Aslan's return. The wolves that had seemed so terrifying earlier now slunk away with their tails between their legs. Reepicheep, never one to miss an opportunity for gallantry, organized a group of talking mice to nip at the heels of the retreating enemy. "Remember this day, you cowards." His tiny voice carried surprisingly far. "Remember how you fled before the might of Narnia's true king." But the crucial moment was approaching. Edmund had reached the witch, and with one brave slash, he shattered her wand. The explosion threw him backward, injured but successful. The witch's most powerful weapon was destroyed, but she was far from defenseless. Would Peter reach his brother in time? Would Aslan arrive before the witch could take her revenge? The battlefield seemed to hold its breath as these questions hung in the air. Lucy clutched her cordial, given to her by Father Christmas, wondering if she would need to use it soon. Susan knocked an arrow to her bow, ready to defend her family. The White Witch's voice cut through the chaos. "You think this changes anything? Narnia is mine." But there was desperation in her tone now, a crack in her icy composure. She knew, as did everyone on that battlefield, that everything had changed with Aslan's return. The Great Lion's presence had brought more than just military reinforcement. It had brought hope. The very air seemed warmer, the endless winter's grip weakening with each passing moment. Spring was returning to Narnia, just as Aslan had returned to his people. As the battle reached its climax, every character had their part to play. Peter's leadership, Edmund's sacrifice, Susan's precision, Lucy's healing, Reepicheep's courage, Trumpkin's steadfastness, and Mr. Tumnus's loyalty. All would be needed before the day was done. But what would be the cost of victory? How would this day change each of them? And even if they won, could Narnia ever truly recover from the witch's long winter? These questions raced through Lucy's mind as she watched Aslan band closer and closer to the heart of the battle, where her brother Peter now faced the White Witch herself. The fate of Narnia hung in the balance, and the next few moments would determine everything. Would good triumph over evil? Would sacrifice be rewarded? Would faith be justified? The answers were about to unfold in ways that would change them all forever. The golden sun rose over Caer Paravel, its warm rays dancing across the marble floors of the great hall. The battle had ended, and with it, the 100-year winter that had gripped Narnia in its icy clutches. But what would become of this magical land now that peace had finally returned? Lucy stood before a grand mirror, her heart racing as she watched her reflection. Gone was the little girl in the school uniform. In her place stood a young royal, draped in a flowing gown of crimson and gold. "Do you think we're ready for this?" she whispered to Susan, who was adjusting her own elegant deep blue dress. "Ready or not, Narnia needs us," Susan replied, her practical nature showing through despite the magnificence of the occasion. "Though I must admit, it feels rather surreal, doesn't it? Yesterday, we were running from the White Witch, and today..." Peter paced nervously in his chamber, his new sword belt feeling both foreign and familiar at the same time. Edmund watched his brother with understanding eyes, having undergone his own transformation from betrayer to hero. "You know, Peter," Edmund said thoughtfully, "perhaps this is exactly why Aslan chose us. We're not perfect, but we've learned what it truly means to lead." The great hall of Caer Paravel buzzed with excitement as creatures of all kinds gathered for the coronation. Mr. Tumnus, now fully recovered and dressed in his finest scarves, wiped tears of joy from his eyes as he saw Lucy. "My dear friend," he said, embracing her. "Who would have thought that our chance meeting would lead to all this?" Reepicheep, standing proud despite his small stature, led a contingent of mice warriors in formation. "Your Majesties," he proclaimed with a flourishing bow, "we stand ready to serve the true rulers of Narnia." His unwavering loyalty brought smiles to all four siblings' faces. Trumpkin, usually gruff and practical, found himself caught up in the emotion of the moment. "Well," he muttered, adjusting his ceremonial armor, "I suppose if we must have kings and queens, we could do far worse than you lot." Coming from him, it was high praise indeed. The ceremony itself was both grand and intimate, with Aslan's presence filling the hall with warmth and majesty. As he spoke, his voice carried not just through the hall, but seemed to resonate within each heart present. "To the glistening eastern sea, I give you Queen Lucy the Valiant. To the great western wood, King Edmund the Just. To the radiant southern sun, Queen Susan the Gentle. And to the clear northern sky, I give you King Peter the Magnificent." But what thoughts ran through the minds of these children-turned-monarchs as their crowns were placed upon their heads? Lucy remembered her first steps into Narnia, the magic of discovery still fresh in her heart. Edmund felt the weight of his past mistakes and subsequent redemption, knowing they would make him a more understanding ruler. Susan contemplated the practical challenges ahead, while Peter felt the responsibility of leadership settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. As the crowns were placed upon their heads, something remarkable happened. The siblings felt not just the physical weight of the golden circlets, but a deeper change within themselves. They were no longer just children who had stumbled through a wardrobe, but true rulers of Narnia, chosen by Aslan himself. The celebrations that followed were unlike anything the children had ever experienced. Centaurs raised their swords in salute, fauns danced with dryads, and talking animals sang songs that would be remembered for generations to come. Even the trees seemed to dance, their leaves shimmering with joy in the afternoon light. But amidst the festivities, questions lingered in the air. How would these young rulers govern their new kingdom? What challenges awaited them in the peace that followed war? And perhaps most intriguingly, how would their experiences in our world shape their rule in Narnia? As night fell and the celebrations continued, the four siblings stood together on a balcony overlooking their kingdom. The stars seemed brighter in Narnia, twinkling with promises of adventures yet to come. Lucy turned to her siblings, her eyes bright with wonder. "Do you think," she asked, "this is what we were meant for all along?" Peter smiled, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Perhaps, Lou, but I think the real question is, what will we make of this opportunity?" Susan gazed out at the eastern sea, its waters reflecting the starlight. "Whatever comes next," she said firmly, "we'll face it together." Edmund, who had been quiet for some time, finally spoke. "Just as Aslan believed in us, we must believe in ourselves and in Narnia." And so began the golden age of Narnia, with 4 thrones filled by 4 siblings who had learned the true meaning of courage, justice, gentleness, and valor. But as any wise ruler knows, the coronation is not the end of the story, it's only the beginning. What adventures and challenges await these newly crowned monarchs? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, Narnia would never be the same again. The great hall of Caer Paravel gleamed with morning light as High King Peter sat upon his throne, his golden crown catching the sun's rays. The years following their coronation had transformed the once uncertain children into wise and beloved rulers. But how did these ordinary children from Finchley become such extraordinary monarchs? Lucy, now a graceful young woman, still maintained her childlike wonder as she walked through the castle gardens. The youngest queen had become known throughout the realm as Lucy the Valiant, her healing, cordial, and gentle heart bringing comfort to countless Narnians. "Do you remember," she asked Mr. Tumnus, who remained her closest confidant, "when we first met by the lamppost? Who would have thought that moment would lead to all of this?" Edmund, once the betrayer turned just king, had grown into perhaps the wisest of the 4. His past experiences had given him unique insight into matters of justice and mercy. In the great court of Caer Paravel, Edmund the Just listened carefully to disputes between creatures of all kinds, from talking mice to giants, always seeking the truth beneath the surface. But what had transformed this once selfish boy to such a fair-minded ruler? Susan's practical nature had blossomed into diplomatic brilliance. The gentle queen hosted ambassadors from Calormen, Archenland, and the Lone Islands, her beauty and grace becoming legendary throughout all known lands. Yet she never lost sight of her role as protector of Narnia. "Beauty serves best when it protects the weak," she would often say to young courtiers seeking her counsel. Peter, the High King, had grown from a boy playing at leadership into a true sovereign. His decisions were guided by consultation with his siblings, and most importantly, with Aslan, who would appear when Narnia needed him most. But what challenges tested these young rulers during their golden age? Reepicheep, the valiant mouse knight, became captain of the royal guard, his tiny sword and massive courage defending the realm from any who would threaten its peace. "Size matters not," he would proclaim, "when honor guides the heart." His legendary duels and unwavering loyalty became the stuff of Narnian ballads. Under their rule, the talking beasts flourished, and the spirits of trees and waters danced freely once more. The dryads emerged from their long winter sleep, filling the forests with music and laughter. The merpeople's songs could be heard along the eastern shores, their melodies carrying tales of the 4 thrones and the peace they brought to Narnia. Trumpkin, though not yet born in this golden age, would later hear tales of how the 4 monarchs would ride out together on great hunts, their laughter echoing through forests that had once been silent under the White Witch's eternal winter. But what made these hunts more than mere sport? The answers lay in how the Pevensies ruled not as conquerors but as guardians. They remembered their own world and brought the best of their understanding to Narnia while embracing its magical nature. They built schools where young fauns studied alongside young dwarfs, created forums where all creatures could speak their minds, and established laws that protected the rights of every Narnian, from the smallest talking mouse to the largest giant. But perhaps their greatest achievement was how they helped Narnia heal from the scars of the White Witch's reign. The endless winter had left deep wounds in the land and its people. But under the Four Thrones, these wounds began to heal. The siblings understood that true leadership meant serving their subjects, not commanding them. Yet even in these golden days, there were challenges. Raiders from the north tested their borders, diplomatic relations with Calormen required delicate handling, and the occasional magical threat would emerge from the wild lands of the west. How did 4 children from another world handle such adult responsibilities? They did it together, each bringing their unique strengths to every challenge. Peter's courage, Susan's wisdom, Edmund's justice, and Lucy's faith combined to create a rule that would be remembered for centuries as Narnia's golden age. They never forgot Aslan's teachings or their humble beginnings, which kept them grounded despite their royal status. As the years passed, the Pevensies grew not just in age but in wisdom. They learned that ruling was not about sitting on thrones, but about standing with their people. They discovered that true nobility came not from crowns but from choices, and that the greatest magic in Narnia was not in spells or potions, but in the love they shared with their subjects. But even as they ruled wisely and well, something their other world remained with them. Sometimes, late at night, they would gather in Lucy's chambers and remember their life in England, the professor's house, the wardrobe, the life they had left behind. These memories kept them connected to their roots and helped them understand both worlds better. What they didn't know was that their golden age, like all ages, would face its greatest test, not in battle or diplomacy, but in an unexpected hunt for a white stag that would lead them back to where their adventure began. That tale belongs to another chapter in the great story of Narnia. The golden sunlight streamed through the towering trees of the Lantern Waste as 4 horses thundered across the forest floor, their hooves creating a rhythmic symphony against the earth. High King Peter, Queen Susan, King Edmund, and Queen Lucy, now grown and regal after years of ruling Narnia, pursued the legendary white stag with determination gleaming in their eyes. "There, did you see it?" Lucy called out, her voice carrying the same childlike excitement that had marked her first discovery of Narnia, though she was now a graceful young woman. The flash of pure white darting between the trees ahead had caught her keen eye. Edmund, who had grown to a wise and just king, urged his horse forward. "I saw it too. They say whoever catches the white stag is granted wishes. Imagine what we could do for Narnia with such a gift." The years had transformed him from the bitter boy who had once betrayed his siblings to a noble ruler respected throughout the realm. Susan, her long dark hair flowing behind her as she rode, called out with practical concern. "Perhaps we shouldn't venture too far from Cair Paravel. Remember what Trumpkin said about strange occurrences in these woods." Even after all these years, she remained the voice of reason among her siblings. "Come now, Sue," Peter responded with a laugh, his golden crown glinting in the dappled sunlight. "Where's your sense of adventure? We'd face far greater challenges than a forest chase." The High King had grown into his role magnificently, but never lost the playful spirit he shared with his siblings. As they rode deeper into the woods, the air began to feel different, somehow thicker with memory. The trees seemed to whisper among themselves, their ancient branches swaying in a wind that wasn't there. Lucy felt a familiar sensation stirring in her heart, something that reminded her of Mr. Tumnus and that first magical meeting so many years ago. "Does anyone else feel strange?" she asked, pulling her horse to a slower pace. "Something about this place?" Edmund nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, there's something familiar about these woods, though I can't quite place it." He glanced around, trying to capture the elusive memory that danced just beyond his reach. Suddenly, they came upon something that made them all draw their horses to a halt. There, standing in a clearing, was a peculiar sight that seemed both foreign and anciently familiar. An iron lamppost, its flame burning steady and bright despite the daylight. The lamppost, Susan whispered, her eyes wide with recognition. But how can this be? We haven't seen this place since. Peter dismounted his horse, drawn to the ancient iron post. Since we first came to Narnia, he finished, running his hand along the cool metal. Do you remember, Lucy? This is where you first met Mr. Tumnus. Lucy felt tears welling in her eyes as memories flooded back, not of their years as kings and queens, but of being a little girl in a strange land, meeting a fawn with packages and an umbrella. How could I forget? It feels like yesterday, and yet. Look, Edmund pointed to something beyond the lamppost. There's something through those trees. They're packed so closely together, but there's something. The siblings exchanged glances, their hearts beating with a mixture of curiosity and inexplicable anxiety. They left their horses and pressed forward on foot, pushing through branches that seemed to grow thicker and more numerous with each step. These aren't like normal Narnian trees, Susan observed, her voice tight with uncertainty. They feel more like fur coats. Lucy finished, and suddenly they all knew. The realization hit them like a wave. They were no longer pushing through branches, but through familiar fur coats in a familiar wardrobe. What happened next was a blur of movement and sensation. One moment, they were grown kings and queens in royal hunting clothes, and the next, they tumbled out of the wardrobe in Professor Kirk's spare room, once again children in the clothes they had worn when they first entered Narnia. They lay there on the floor, staring at each other in shock as they processed what had just happened. How could years of ruling a kingdom of growing up, of countless adventures and experiences, suddenly be reversed in an instant? Did that really happen? Edmund asked, looking at his now young hands in disbelief. Peter stood up, no longer the High King, but once again a boy trying to be brave for his siblings. It must have. We all remember it, don't we? Lucy rushed to the wardrobe, throwing open the door, but found only the solid wooden back. No forest, no lamppost, no Narnia. But why? She asked, her voice trembling. Why bring us back now? Susan placed a gentle hand on her sister's shoulder. Perhaps our time was finished. We learned what we needed to learn, did what we needed to do. As they stood there trying to comprehend their return, they could almost hear Aslan's voice in their hearts, reminding them that nothing happens by chance and that every journey has its purpose. They were different children now, braver, wiser and stronger, even if their bodies had returned to their younger selves. But one question lingered in their minds. Would they ever return to Narnia? And if they did, what new adventures awaited them in that magical land they had come to call home? The transition was as sudden as a candle being snuffed out. One moment, the Pevensey children were racing through the Narnian woods, their royal garments flowing behind them as they pursued the legendary white stag, and the next, they found themselves tumbling out of the wardrobe in Professor Kirk's house, wearing the same clothes they had on when they first entered Narnia. Lucy, still caught in the excitement of the chase, spoke first, her voice filled with confusion. But I was just about to catch up to the white stag. Peter, didn't you see how close I was? She looked down at her now childish hands, no longer bearing the rings she had worn as Queen Lucy the Valiant. Peter, who moments ago had been King Peter the Magnificent, found himself struggling to maintain his balance as his body adjusted to its younger form. This can't be right, he muttered, running his hands through his hair. We were just in the western woods, weren't we? Susan, Edmund, you saw it too. Susan, ever practical, was already examining their surroundings. The familiar musty smell of the spare room, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, and the old wardrobe standing exactly as they had left it. It's as if we never left, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. But we did leave, didn't we? We lived entire lives there. We ruled Narnia for years. Edmund, who had grown from a troubled boy into a just and wise king, pressed his hand against the back of the wardrobe. 15 years, he said quietly. We spent 15 years in Narnia. How can we be back here, and everything's exactly the same? The siblings gathered closer together, their minds racing with memories that now felt like dreams. Lucy remembered the last treaty she had signed, the diplomatic meetings with the merpeople just the previous week. Peter could still feel the weight of his crown, the responsibility of leading armies and making decisions that affected all of Narnia. Susan thought of her suitors, the grand balls, and the alliances she had helped forge. Edmund recalled the justice he had dispensed from his throne, the wisdom he had gained through years of rule. What about Mr. Tumnus? Lucy suddenly asked, her voice small and worried. And the beavers, and Aslan. Were they all just a dream? Peter put his arm around his youngest sister. No, Lou, it was real. It had to be real. We all remember it too clearly for it to be just a dream. Just then, they heard footsteps in the hallway and Mrs. Macready's voice calling out to the tourists she was leading through the house. The four siblings looked at each other, the realization hitting them all at once. They were children again, in a world where no one would believe their story, where their years of experience and wisdom would have to be hidden behind young faces. Susan touched the wardrobe one last time. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" she asked, her voice filled with longing. Aslan once told me that things never happen the same way twice. Lucy remembered, though the memory now felt distant, like trying to hold on to water. But he also said he would always be with us, even in our world. Edmund, who had perhaps changed the most during their time in Narnia, spoke thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why we were brought back. To bring a bit of Narnia with us, to use what we learned there here in England." Peter nodded, straightening his shoulders in a gesture that even in his young body carried the dignity of the high king he had been. "It's right. We may be back in England, but we're still the kings and queens of Narnia. We always will be." As they left the spare room, each of them carried the weight of their experiences, their memories and their growth. They were children again in body, their hearts and minds held the wisdom of the adults they had become in Narnia. How would they navigate this familiar yet now strange world? How would they reconcile their two lives? And most importantly, would they ever find their way back to the magical land that had become their true home? The answers to these questions would have to wait as Mrs. Macready's tour group approached. But as they hurried away from the spare room, they shared knowing looks, silent promises to hold on to their experiences in Narnia, to keep their faith in Aslan, and to live up to the titles they had earned. Once a king or queen of Narnia, always a king or queen of Narnia. The morning sun filtered through the train station's grimy windows as the Pevensey children waited for their respective school trains. It had been a year since their return from Narnia, though the magical realm remained ever present in their thoughts. Lucy, now a year older but still carrying that same sparkle of wonder in her eyes, sat on her worn leather suitcase, absently twirling her hair while lost in memories of talking animals and dancing trees. "Do you ever wonder," Lucy began, breaking the contemplative silence among her siblings, "if Narnia needs us again?" A question hung in the air, heavy with longing and possibility. Peter, who had been studying his pocket watch, looked up with a mixture of nostalgia and resignation on his face. "Lou, we can't spend all our time waiting for another adventure," Susan responded practically, though her voice carried a hint of wistfulness. "We have our light here now." Edmund, who had been unusually quiet, shifted uncomfortably on the wooden bench. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for the Pevensey children. As the station grew more crowded with students rushing to catch their trains, something strange began to happen. At first, it was subtle, a familiar tingling sensation, like the whisper of magic in their veins. Then came the pull, gentle but insistent, reminiscent of the feeling they'd experienced when they'd first stumbled through the wardrobe. "Do you feel that?" Edmund asked suddenly, standing up straight, his eyes wide with recognition. The others nodded, their hearts beginning to race with anticipation. The mundane sounds of the train station began to fade, replaced by a distant roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lucy gasped as she caught a glimpse of something impossible, a golden mane flickering in the corner of her eye. "Aslan," she whispered, but when she turned to look, there was only the bustling crowd of students. The pull grew stronger, and the air around them seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. "Hold hands," Peter commanded, falling naturally into his role as protector. "Whatever's happening, we need to stay together." The siblings formed a circle, their hands clasped tightly, as the world around them began to blur. Susan, despite her earlier pragmatism, felt her heart leap with joy as the familiar sensation of magic enveloped them. But how? She wondered aloud. Why now? The answer came in the form of a warm breeze that carried the scent of pine needles and wild flowers, so different from the smoke and steel of the train station. The walls around them seemed to dissolve, and for a moment they existed in a space between worlds where time had no meaning and magic was as natural as breathing. Through this ethereal transition, memories of their previous adventures flashed through their minds. Mr. Tumnus's cozy cave, the beaver's dam, the great stone table where Aslan had made his sacrifice. But there was something different this time, an urgency they hadn't felt before. As the magic swirled around them, they could hear distant voices calling their names, familiar voices of their Narnian friends. Reepicheep's valiant declarations, Trumpkin's gruff but loyal tones, and underneath it all, the deep, resonant roar of Aslan himself. "Narnia needs us," Lucy stated with certainty, her voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "But it feels different this time, doesn't it?" Edmund nodded, his expression serious. "Time moves differently there. Who knows how long it's been since we left?" The transformation continued, and they could feel solid ground forming beneath their feet. Not the hard concrete of the train station, but soft, wild earth. The air grew clearer, fresher, filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant ocean waves. Peter tightened his grip on his siblings' hands. "Whatever we're returning to, whatever battle needs fighting or wrong needs righting, we'll face it together." His words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned in both victory and defeat. As the magic reached its crescendo, questions raced through their minds. How much time had passed in Narnia? What crisis required their return? Would they find their old friends? And most importantly, what role would they play in this new chapter of Narnian history? The world finally solidified around them, but what they saw wasn't the Narnia they remembered. The landscape before them was both familiar and strange, changed by the passage of time in ways they couldn't have imagined. Their return to Narnia marked not just the beginning of a new adventure, but a test of their faith, courage, and the bonds that held them together. As they stood there, taking in their surroundings, Lucy voiced the question they were all thinking. "What do you suppose has happened to Narnia while we've been away?" The answer to that question would lead them on an adventure that would challenge everything they thought they knew about this magical realm and their place within it. The call back to Narnia had come, but this was just the beginning. What adventures awaited them? What dangers lurked in the shadows of this changed land? And most importantly, what role would they play in shaping Narnia's destiny once again? Lucy's heart pounded as she stepped through the familiar wardrobe doorway, her siblings close behind. But the Narnia that greeted them was not the one they had left behind. The once familiar landscape had transformed dramatically, leaving them standing in a place that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. "Something's different," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she reached for Peter's hand. The ancient trees that had once whispered secrets now stood silent, their branches reaching toward an unfamiliar sky. "How long do you suppose we've been away?" Peter surveyed the landscape with a furrowed brow, his hand instinctively resting where his sword Rindan should have been. "It's as if time has moved differently here," he said, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The ruins of what appeared to be ancient structures poked through the undergrowth, their weathered stones telling tales of centuries past. Susan, ever practical, began examining the crumbling walls nearby. "Look at these markings," she called out, running her fingers along the worn stone. "These seem like Narnian symbols, but they're so old." Her voice carried a note of disbelief as she added, "Could these be from our time?" Edmund, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Do you remember the stories Mr. Tumnus told us? About how time flows differently between our world and Narnia?" He paused, letting the implications sink in. "What if it hasn't been just years, but centuries?" The reality of their situation began to dawn on them as they ventured further into this changed realm. The once familiar paths they had walked as kings and queens were now overgrown, and the great castles they had called home were reduced to ruins covered in ivy and moss. Lucy's eyes welled with tears as she thought of their old friends. Mr. Tumnus, the beavers, all of them. They're gone, aren't they? The weight of time's passage hung heavy in the air, and even the usually optimistic Lucy felt its burden. As they walked, they began to notice signs of current inhabitants. Fresh hoof prints in the mud, recently broken branches, and the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. This Narnia was not empty, it was alive with new stories and new adventures and new challenges. Listen, Susan suddenly whispered, holding up her hand. The sounds of approaching footsteps caused them to quickly hide behind a cluster of ancient stones. From their hiding place, they watched as a group of creatures passed by. Talking animals and mythical beings, just as they remembered. But these were not the ones they had known. What do you suppose has happened here? Peter wondered aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. What great events have shaped Narnia in our absence? Their questions were soon answered by the appearance of Trumpkin the dwarf, though their first meeting was far from friendly. The dwarf's initial skepticism about their identities revealed just how much time had truly passed. They had become legends, stories told to children, their reign now known as the Golden Age of Narnia. As they shared their story with Trumpkin, the reality of their situation became clearer. Hundreds of years had passed in Narnia, while only 1 year had gone by in their world. The revelation left them grappling with complex emotions, grief for the friends they had lost, amazement at how their story had become legend, and uncertainty about their place in this new Narnia. But why are we here now? Edmund asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Aslan must have brought us back for a reason. Lucy, who had always shared a special connection with Aslan, nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps Narnia needs us again, just in a different way than before. We may not be the kings and queens we once were, but we still carry those experiences with us. As night began to fall in this changed realm, the Pevensies found themselves facing an entirely new adventure. They were no longer returning to a familiar kingdom, but stepping into a land that needed their help in ways they had yet to discover. The question wasn't just how Narnia had changed, but how they would adapt to these changes and find their place in this new era. What challenges awaited them in this transformed Narnia? How would they navigate a world where their own story had become legend? And most importantly, what role would they play in shaping Narnia's future once again? The answers to these questions lay ahead, but one thing was certain. Their journey was far from over. As they settled down for their first night in this changed realm, each of them knew that tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new allies, and new adventures in a land that, despite its changes, would always hold a special place in their hearts. The Pevensey children stood at the edge of what they once knew as Caer Paravel, their hearts heavy with the realization that centuries had indeed passed in their beloved Narnia. The crumbling stones and overgrown vegetation told a story of time's relentless march, but it was the appearance of a peculiar dwarf that would truly bridge their past with the present. Lucy, ever observant, was the first to notice Trumpkin's approach. The dwarf's red beard was matted with seawater, and his expression was a mixture of disbelief and worriness. "Is it really them?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "The kings and queens of old." Peter stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for a sword that was no longer at his hip. "We are the Pevensies," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of a high king, even if his current appearance was that of a schoolboy. "Though it seems we've returned to a very different Narnia than the one we left." Trumpkin's initial skepticism was evident in his furrowed brow. "Different. That's putting it mildly, Your Majesty, if you truly are who you claim to be." He proceeded to share tales of the Narnia they had returned to, one where talking beasts lived in hiding, where trees no longer danced, and where their very existence had become legend. Susan, practical as ever, asked, "How long has it been since the Golden Age?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Trumpkin's answer confirmed their fears. Centuries had passed, and their reign was now the stuff of bedtime stories. Edmund, who had learned the hard way about trust and betrayal, studied the dwarf carefully. "Why have you sought us out? Surely there must be a reason beyond curiosity." His words prompted Trumpkin to reveal the true purpose of his mission. Prince Caspian, the rightful heir to the Narnian throne, was in danger, and the old magic had somehow brought them back. As Trumpkin explained the current political climate, Lucy couldn't help but remember Mr. Tumnus and their first meeting. How different things were now. "But surely Aslan must have a plan," she interjected, her faith unwavering despite the circumstances. "He wouldn't have brought us back without reason." The mention of Aslan caused Trumpkin to shift uncomfortably. Many Narnians haven't seen Aslan in so long, they've begun to doubt he ever existed. This revelation sent a chill through the siblings. How could anyone forget Aslan? The dwarf's tale continued, weaving a complex narrative of Telmarine occupation, suppressed magic, and a young prince's fight for his birthright. With each word, the Pevensies began to understand why they had been called back. This wasn't just about returning to Narnia. It was about restoring faith in the old ways, in magic, and in Aslan himself. "Will you help us?" Trumpkin finally asked, his gruff exterior softening slightly. "Will you help Prince Caspian reclaim what is rightfully his?" Peter exchanged glances with his siblings. They had all grown older in England, yet younger again in Narnia. But their experiences, their memories, and their love for this magical land remained unchanged. "We will," Peter declared, speaking for all of them. "But first, you must tell us everything you know about the current situation." As Trumpkin began to guide them through this new version of their beloved Rion, each step revealed how much had changed. The paths they once knew were overgrown, the landmarks altered by time. Yet somehow, in the company of their newfound ally, they began to feel the stirrings of hope. Susan, ever practical, asked the questions that needed asking. About the Telmarine forces, about Caspian's whereabouts, about potential allies. Edmund focused on strategy, his mind already working through possible plans. Lucy, meanwhile, kept her eyes on the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of the old magic she remembered so well. But questions lingered in their minds. Would they be able to adapt to this new Narnia? Could they help restore what was lost? And most importantly, where was Aslan in all of this? The answers would come, but for now, they had to trust in their guide and in each other. As they followed Trumpkin deeper into the forest, the siblings couldn't help but feel that this adventure would be unlike any they had experienced before. This wasn't about defeating a clear enemy like the White Witch. This was about rekindling faith, restoring magic, and helping a people remember who they truly were. What challenges awaited them in this changed realm? How would they prove themselves to a population that had forgotten them? And could they truly help Prince Caspian restore Narnia to its former glory? The answers lay ahead as they ventured further into a land both familiar and strange, guided by a dwarf who was gradually becoming more than just a guide. He was becoming their bridge to this new Narnia. As the Pevensey children continued their journey through the transformed Narnia with Trumpkin, their path led them to a small clearing where they encountered one of the most remarkable creatures they'd ever meet. There, standing proudly despite his diminutive size, was Reepicheep, the mouse warrior, his tail adorned with a red feather and a tiny sword at his side. Lucy couldn't help but smile at the sight, though she knew better than to let her amusement show too openly. She'd heard tales of the noble mice of Narnia, but seeing one in person was something entirely different. Who are these humans who venture so boldly into our territory? Reepicheep's voice rang out, clear and dignified, making Edmund raise his eyebrows in surprise. Peter stepped forward, about to introduce himself, but Reepicheep's keen eyes had already noticed the ancient sword at Peter's side. "By my whiskers," the mouse exclaimed, dropping into an elegant bow. "I, King Peter, and Queen Susan, King Edmund, and Queen Lucy. The legends speak true. You have returned to us in Narnia's hour of need." Susan exchanged glances with her siblings, still adjusting to how different this Narnia was from the one they'd known. "How long have you been waiting for us, Reepicheep?" she asked gently. The mouse warrior straightened up, his tiny chest swelling with pride. "My people have kept faith for generations, your majesties. We mice have never forgotten the prophecies, nor our sacred duty." He paused, his whiskers twitching with emotion. "Did you know that it was mice who gnawed through Aslan's bonds where the White Witch had him trapped? You have carried that honor through the centuries." Edmund's face darkened at the mention of the White Witch, but Reepicheep continued, "And now, when Narnia faces new dangers, here you are, just as the stories promised. But tell me, what do you make of our changed realm? Does it pain your hearts as it does mine to see what has become of our beloved land?" Lucy knelt down to be closer to Reepicheep's level, touched by the genuine concern in his voice. "It's very different," she admitted. "But that's why we're here, isn't it? To help make things right again." Reepicheep's eyes sparkled with determination. "Indeed, Queen Lucy, and my sword is yours to command. Though I may be small, my heart is as big as any warrior's, and my honor is boundless." He drew his tiny sword, making it glint in the filtered sunlight. "But I must warn you, dark forces are stirring. The trees no longer dance, the rivers no longer sing, and many creatures have forgotten their true nature." Peter looked thoughtful. "What can you tell us about these changes, Reepicheep? What's caused Narnia to become so different?" The mouse's expression grew serious. "That is a tale that requires both courage to tell and wisdom to understand. But perhaps the real question is, are you prepared to face what Narnia has become to help restore what it once was?" Trumpkin, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "The mouse speaks truth, your majesties. Things are not as simple as they once were. Even loyalty itself has become a complicated matter in these times." Reepicheep turned sharply. "Loyalty is never complicated, dear Trumpkin. It is the world that tries to make it so. But a true heart knows its path, just as a sword knows its target." He faced the Pevensies again. "Will you allow me to join your cause? To fight alongside you as we seek to awaken Narnia's sleeping spirit?" The siblings looked at each other, and Peter nodded. "We would be honored to have you with us, Reepicheep. Your courage and wisdom would be invaluable." As they continued their journey, now with Reepicheep leading the way alongside Trumpkin, Lucy couldn't help but wonder. What other changes would they discover in this new Narnia? And how would they navigate the complex web of loyalty and betrayal that seemed to have taken root in their absence? The Mouse Warrior's presence brought both comfort and concern. Comfort in his unwavering dedication to their cause, and concern for what his warnings might mean for their mission. As they walked, Reepicheep shared tales of resistance and hope, of small victories and crushing defeats, painting a picture of a Narnia that needed its kings and queens more than ever. But what challenges lay ahead? What forces would they have to face to restore Narnia to its former glory? And would their combined strength, the wisdom of the Pevensies, the loyalty of Trumpkin, and the honor of Reepicheep be enough to overcome whatever darkness had taken hold of their beloved realm? The answers to these questions lay somewhere in the transformed landscape before them, waiting to be discovered. And with each step, they moved closer to understanding just how much their beloved Narnia had changed, and what it would take to bring back its magic. The morning sun cast long shadows through the dense Narnian forest as Lucy, Peter, Susan, and Edmund, accompanied by Trumpkin and the newly joined Reepicheep, made their way through overgrown paths. Lucy couldn't shake the feeling of familiarity with their surroundings, though everything seemed different from what she remembered. "Does anyone else feel like we've been here before?" Lucy asked, her voice carrying a mix of uncertainty and excitement. The others paused, looking around with growing recognition in their eyes. Peter stepped forward, brushing aside some vines. "These stones, they're not just random ruins. Look at the pattern." He traced his fingers along what appeared to be ancient masonry, now covered in moss and weathered by centuries of exposure. "By my whiskers," Reepicheep proclaimed, standing tall on a fallen column. Could this be the legendary Caer Paravel itself? The noble mouse's eyes sparkled with reverence as he spoke of the ancient seat of Narnian royalty. Susan moved closer to examine the stonework. "The architecture, it's exactly as I remember it. But how can this be? It looks like it's been abandoned for hundreds of years." Her practical nature struggled to reconcile their memories of the grand castle with these weathered remains. Edmund, who had been quietly exploring nearby, called out to the others. "Over here, I'd found something." The group hurried to where he stood before what appeared to be a wall covered in thick vegetation. As they cleared away the growth, familiar patterns emerged. The apple orchard would have been right there, Lucy pointed, memories flooding back. And that's where we had our archery practice. Her voice trembled with emotion as the reality of their discovery sank in. Trumpkin, who had been skeptical of their claims to be the kings and queens of old, watched with growing amazement as the Pevensies navigated the ruins with increasing confidence. "But how is this possible?" he asked, his gruff voice softening with wonder. Peter explained as they continued to explore. "Time moves differently between our world and Narnia. What was a mere year for us could have been centuries here." The weight of this revelation hung heavy in the air as they processed the implications. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, Edmund spotted something that made his heart race. The treasury chamber. It should be right below us. The siblings exchanged knowing looks, remembering the secret entrance they had used countless times during their reign. Working together, they cleared away debris and vegetation, revealing ancient steps leading down into darkness. Reepicheep insisted on going first, his small sword at the ready, declaring it his duty to protect their majesties. His unwavering courage, despite his size, brought smiles to their faces even in this solemn moment. The chamber below held their personal treasures. Susan's bow and arrows, Lucy's healing cordial and dagger, Peter's sword and shield, and Edmund's sword and armor. Each item was exactly where they had left them, preserved through the centuries in magical chests that had protected them from time's decay. As they retrieved their belongings, Lucy noticed tears in Susan's eyes. "What's wrong, Sue?" she asked gently. "It's just, all this time, everything we lived through, everything we accomplished. It's all ancient history now," Susan replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "All our friends, the talking animals, the spirits of the trees and waters." Peter placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But we're here now, when Narnia needs us again. Perhaps that's why Aslan brought us back, not to relive the past, but to help shape Narnia's future." Trumpkin, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "I spent my life hearing tales of the Golden Age, of the 4 children who sat on the thrones of Caer Paravel. I never thought." He trailed off, looking at them with new understanding. Reepicheep raised his sword in a salute. "Your Majesties, though your castle may lie in ruins, your legacy lives on in the hearts of every true Narnian. We must now focus on the task at hand, restoring peace to our beloved land once more." As they gathered their ancient weapons and prepared to leave the ruins, Edmund voiced what they were all thinking. "But why has Narnia changed so much? What happened during all those years we were away?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but urgent. The discovery of Caer Paravel's ruins had given them their bearings and their royal implements, but it had also raised countless questions about the years that had passed and the challenges that lay ahead. Looking back at the crumbling walls of their former home, Lucy felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Whatever happened here, whatever changes came to Narnia, we're back now. And this time, we won't leave until we've made things right. The group emerged from the ruins into the afternoon sun, each carrying not just their recovered treasures, but also the weight of their responsibility to Narnia. The ancient ruins of Caer Paravel stood behind them as a testament to both what was lost and what could be gained, as they prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them in this changed Narnia. The moonlight cast long shadows through the crumbling ruins of Caer Paravel as the Pevensey siblings huddled around Trumpkin, who had begun to unfold the tale of Prince Caspian. The dwarf's gruff voice carried through the night air, mixing with the distant sound of waves crushing against the shore. "You see," Trumpkin began, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames of their campfire, "Narnia isn't what it used to be. The Telmarines have ruled for generations, and the old Narnians, the talking beasts, dwarfs, and magical creatures, have been driven into hiding." Lucy's eyes widened with concern. "But how? What happened to all our friends?" Trumpkin sighed heavily before continuing. "The Telmarines fear the old ways, the magic of Narnia. They spent centuries trying to stamp it out. But now, there's hope in the form of a young prince, Caspian X. Peter leaned forward, his face serious. Tell us about this prince. The story that followed painted a picture of a young man raised in the very heart of Tamarine power. Prince Caspian had grown up hearing tales of old Narnia from his nurse and later from his tutor, Dr. Cornelius. These stories, forbidden by his uncle, King Miraz, had planted seeds of wonder and truth in the young prince's heart. But why would his uncle forbid such tales? Susan asked, a practical mind seeking to understand the political implications. Trumpkin's expression darkened. Because Miraz is a usurper. He murdered Caspian's father, the rightful king, and now that his own son has been born, he plans to dispose of Caspian as well. Edmund, who knew all too well the pain of betrayal, shifted uncomfortably. So Caspian fled. I, Trumpkin, confirmed. Dr. Cornelius warned him just in time. The prince escaped into the woods, where he found us, the old Narnians. But now he needs your help, the kings and queens of old, to reclaim his throne and restore peace to Narnia. As the dwarf spoke, Lucy noticed something moving in the shadows beyond their camp. Her heart leaped when she recognized the familiar shape of Reepicheep, the valiant mouse warrior, emerging into the firelight. Indeed, Reepicheep declared with a flourishing bow, and I can attest to the prince's character. He has shown great courage and wisdom beyond his years. The mouse's arrival sparked a series of questions from the Pevensies. How many old Narnians remained? Where was Prince Caspian now? What forces did Miraz command? As Reepicheep and Trumpkin took turns explaining the situation, the gravity of their mission became clear. This wasn't just about helping a lost prince. It was about bringing magic back to Narnia, about restoring balance between the old and the new. Peter's hand unconsciously moved to his sword hilt. But why hasn't Aslan helped? Surely he wouldn't abandon Narnia. A heavy silence fell over the group. It was Lucy who finally spoke, her voice soft but certain. Perhaps that's why we're here. Maybe Aslan is helping, through us. The conversation continued late into the night, with plans being formed and strategies discussed. The Pevensies learned of the hidden fortress where Caspian and the old Narnians had taken refuge, a place called Aslan's How, built over the stone table itself. But as they talked, questions lingered in their minds. Would they be able to unite to the old Narnians behind a Tamarine prince? Could they really challenge King Miraz's army? And most importantly, where was Aslan in all of this? As the fire died down and the stars wheeled overhead, each of them felt the weight of responsibility settling on their shoulders. They weren't just returning to help Narnia this time. They were being called to help shape its future, to bridge the gap between its past and present. Edmund voiced what they were all thinking. It seems we've been called back not just to fight a battle, but to ensure that old and new Narnia can exist together. Lucy nodded, remembering Mr. Tumnus and their first adventure. And perhaps that's the real magic. Not just in talking beasts and ancient spells, but in bringing people together in helping them understand each other. As they prepared for sleep, each of them knew that tomorrow would bring them closer to Prince Caspian and the challenges that lay ahead. But for now, they had a purpose, a mission that would test not just their courage and strength, but their ability to believe in the magic of Narnia once more. The question that hung in the air as they drifted off to sleep was, would they be able to help this lost prince find not just his throne, but a way to unite two very different worlds? The dense forest loomed before the Pevensey children and their companions, its ancient trees standing like silent sentinels in the misty morning light. Lucy, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, led the group forward. She alone had seen Aslan, his golden form beckoning them toward a path that seemed impossible to traverse. Are you absolutely certain about this, Lou? Peter asked, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility that had become so familiar since their first journey to Narnia. This doesn't look like any path I've ever seen. Lucy turned to face her siblings and their companions, her eyes bright with unwavering conviction. I know what I saw, Peter. Aslan was there, just as real as you are now. He wants us to follow this way. Edmund, who had learned to trust his sister's judgment after his own journey of redemption, stepped forward. "I believe Lucy," he declared, remembering how his own doubt had once led him astray. "If she says Aslan showed her the path, then that's the path we should take." Susan, ever practical, surveyed the seemingly impenetrable wall of vegetation before them. "But how can we possibly get through? The undergrowth is too thick, and we don't even know what lies beyond." Reepicheep, the valiant mouse warrior, drew his tiny sword with a flourish. "My queen, if I may. Sometimes the most important paths are the ones that seem impossible at first glance. Isn't that what faith in Aslan teaches us?" Trumpkin the dwarf, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "The mouse speaks truth, though it pains me to admit it. I've seen enough of Aslan's ways to know they rarely make sense at first." As they debated, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the familiar warmth that Lucy recognized instantly. "Can't you feel it?" she asked, closing her eyes. "It's just like when Aslan breathes on you. The path is here, we just have to trust." The group began their journey, with Lucy leading the way. What appeared impossible from a distance revealed itself step by step. Hidden passages opened between ancient trees, and what seemed like solid walls of thorns parted before them like curtains drawn by invisible hands. Peter, walking beside Lucy, marveled at the way forward. "It's as if the forest itself is making way for us," he observed, ducking under a low-hanging branch that seemed to lift itself just as he approached. "That's exactly what's happening," Lucy replied with a smile. "Remember what Mr. Tumnus told us about Narnia? The trees themselves are alive with Aslan's magic." As they progressed deeper into the forest, the path became increasingly mysterious. Sometimes it would reach what appeared to be dead ends, only to find new ways forward after a moment of faithful waiting. The journey became a lesson in trust, each step requiring them to believe in Aslan's guidance, even when they couldn't see the way ahead. Edmund, who had once betrayed his siblings to the White Witch, found himself particularly moved by this experience. "It's rather like forgiveness, isn't it?" he mused aloud. "You can't see where it leads at first, but you have to take that first step anyway." Susan, despite her initial skepticism, began to notice patterns in their seemingly chaotic path. "Look at how the sunlight breaks through the canopy," she pointed out. "It's as if it's marking our way forward." Reepicheep, scampering ahead occasionally to scout, returned with increasingly fascinating reports. "My lieges, the path ahead seems to be forming as we walk. It's the most extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed, and I've witnessed quite a lot." The group encountered various challenges along their journey. Streams that appeared too wide to cross until stepping stones emerged from beneath the water, cliffs that revealed hidden staircases carved into their faces, and dense fog that parted just enough to show them their next step. Trumpkin, who had started the journey with considerable doubt, found himself increasingly amazed. "In all my years in Narnia," he admitted, "I've never seen anything quite like this. It's as if the land itself is guiding us." As they continued their journey, Lucy shared stories of her first encounters with Aslan, helping everyone understand why she trusted him so completely. "It's not just about following blindly," she explained. "It's about knowing who you're following and why." The path led them through places that seemed to defy natural law, areas where winter and summer existed side by side, places where the stars could be seen even in broad daylight, and passages where time itself seemed to flow differently. Peter, watching his youngest sister lead with such certainty, realized how much they had all grown since their first adventure in Narnia. "Do you remember when we first came through the wardrobe?" he asked his siblings. "We never could have managed something like this then." As the day progressed, the impossible path continued to unfold before them, each step bringing them closer to their destination. Though none of them knew exactly where they were heading, they all felt the rightness of their journey in their hearts. The act closes with Lucy spotting something in the distance, something that makes her eyes widen with wonder and recognition. But what could it be? What has Aslan's path been leading them toward all this time? The answer lies ahead, but first, they must complete this extraordinary journey of faith and trust. What mysteries await them at the end of this impossible path? How will this journey change their understanding of Narnia and their role in its destiny? Only by continuing to follow Aslan's guidance will they discover the answers to these questions and more. The ancient forests of Narnia held secrets that had slumbered for centuries, waiting for the right moment to reawaken. As Lucy walked alongside her siblings through the dense woodland, she couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were different today. They seemed to whisper, their leaves rustling with an unusual rhythm that reminded her of the old stories Mr. Tumnus had once told her about the dancing trees of Narnia's golden age. "Do you remember," Lucy said softly to Susan, who walked beside her, "how the trees used to dance? Back when we first ruled Narnia?" The memory hung between them like morning mist, both sweet and slightly painful. Peter, who led their group with his sword at the ready, turned back to them. "They weren't just trees then," he reminded them. "They were our allies, our friends. Each one had a spirit, a dryad that could step out of its trunk and dance under the moonlight." Edmund, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Look there," he whispered, pointing to a massive oak whose branches seemed to sway despite the still air. "Something's different." Reepicheep, who had been scouting ahead, scampered back to the group, his small sword gleaming at his side. "Your Majesties," he announced with a flourish, "the trees are indeed stirring. I've seen it with my own eyes. They remember." Trumpkin, ever the skeptic, grumbled under his breath. "Trees don't remember anything. They're trees." But even as he spoke, a shower of cherry blossoms fell around them, though there wasn't a cherry tree in sight. Lucy felt her heart racing with excitement. "It's just like Aslan said," she breathed. "The old magic never really left. It was only sleeping." She remembered Aslan's words from their previous journey about how faith could awaken what seemed lost forever. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the signs became impossible to ignore. Branches reached out like gentle hands, clearing their path. Leaves formed patterns that seemed to point the way, and the very air hummed with an energy that made their skin tingle. Susan, who had grown more practical during their time away from Narnia, found herself caught between disbelief and wonder. "But how is this possible?" she asked, reaching out to touch a nearby birch whose bark seemed to shimmer with an inner light. "The same way everything in Narnia is possible," Peter replied, his voice filled with the authority of a high king. "Through Aslan's power and the deep magic from before the dawn of time." The group gathered in a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle around them. Lucy remembered something Mr. Tumnus had told her long ago about the Tree People's Parliament, where the oldest and wisest of the Dryads would gather to make important decisions. "What do we do now?" Edmund asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The air was thick with anticipation, and even Trumpkin had fallen silent, his skepticism giving way to awe. Reepicheep, standing tall despite his small stature, spoke up. "If I may suggest, Your Majesties, perhaps we should speak to them. The trees of Narnia have always responded to those who rule by Aslan's grace." Lucy stepped forward, her heart guiding her actions. She remembered how, as a queen of Narnia's golden age, she had often danced with the Dryads under starlit skies. "Noble trees of Narnia," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "We come as friends, as the kings and queens of old, chosen by Aslan himself." The response was immediate and magical. The trees began to sway in earnest, their branches creating a symphony of rustling leaves. Shapes began to form in the air, translucent, graceful figures stepping out of the tree trunks. The Dryads were awakening. But with this awakening came a responsibility that weighed heavily on them all. The trees of Narnia had always been powerful allies, but they had also been targeted by those who feared their strength, including the White Witch, who had turned many to stone during her reign. As the forest came alive around them, questions arose in everyone's minds. What would this awakening mean for Narnia? How would their enemies respond to this resurrection of ancient power? And most importantly, what role would they play in protecting these newly awakened allies? The answers would come, but for now, they stood in wonder as the forest of Narnia stirred to life, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their adventure. The trees were awake, and with them, the old magic of Narnia was returning in full force. But as with all-powerful magic, it brought both hope and danger. And the Pevensies knew their real challenge was just beginning. The morning air crackled with anticipation as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the ancient trees of Narnia. Lucy Pevensey stood at the edge of Aslan's How, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She could see the vast army of the White Witch spreading across the frozen plains like a dark stain on the pristine snow. How had it come to this? "Do you remember our first battle?" Peter's voice came from beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Lucy nodded, remembering that fateful day when they had first fought to free Narnia. "This time is different," he continued. "We're not just fighting for Narnia, we're fighting for its soul." Susan approached them, her bow already strong and ready. "The trees," she whispered, "they're moving." Indeed, the ancient giants of the forest were awakening, their branches swaying without wind, roots pulling free from centuries of slumber. The magic that had stirred the previous day was now in full force, and even Edmund, standing with Trumpkin near the battle lines, could feel it humming through the earth. "Your Majesties," Reepicheep's clear voice cut through the tension. "Our scouts report the witch's army is advancing." The noble mouse stood tall, his tiny sword gleaming. "Shall we show them what it means to face the true rulers of Narnia?" The battle plan was set, but would it be enough? The White Witch had amassed an army larger than before, creatures of darkness and corruption, led by her most loyal generals. Mr. Tumnus, who had been organizing the forest creatures, reported that many of their allies were still hesitant to join the fight. The memory of the witch's cruel winter ran deep. As the armies drew closer, Edmund's voice carried across the battlefield. "Remember what Aslan taught us. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite our fears." His words rang true, especially given his own history with the White Witch. How many others had she deceived, as she had once deceived him? The first clash of armies was deafening. The awakened trees threw themselves into battle, their massive limbs sweeping away scores of the witch's forces. Susan's arrows found their marks with deadly accuracy, while Peter led the charge at the center, his sword flashing in the morning light. Lucy, despite her young age, moved through the chaos with purpose, a healing cordial ready for those who fell. But where was Aslan? The great lion had promised to come, yet as the battle raged on, there was no sign of him. The White Witch herself had appeared on the battlefield, her wand turning living creatures to stone, her sword claiming lives with cruel efficiency. Would this be like the last time, when Aslan's arrival had turned the tide? Reepicheep rallied a company of talking beasts, his tiny voice carrying over the din. For Narnia, for Aslan. The brave mouse's courage inspired others. The witch's forces were pushing them back. Trumpkin fought alongside Edmund, their weapons moving in perfect synchronization, but even they could see the battle wasn't going as planned. The turning point came when Lucy spotted something golden moving through the trees. Could it be? The roar that followed shook the very foundations of Narnia, and the battlefield fell silent for just a moment. Aslan had arrived, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came reinforcements from across the sea, creatures of legend and myth, answering the call of the true king of Narnia. As the battle reached its climax, the Pevensey siblings found themselves fighting side by side, just as they had years ago. But this time, they weren't children playing at being kings and queens. They were the rulers of Narnia, chosen by Aslan himself, fighting for their beloved kingdom. The White Witch's forces began to falter, her power weakening as the ancient magic of Narnia grew stronger. The question hung in the air. Would this be the final battle for Narnia's freedom? As Aslan bounded across the battlefield, his presence filling everyone with renewed strength, the answer seemed to be within reach. But the White Witch wasn't defeated yet, and as she turned her cold eyes toward the Pevensies, it became clear that the most crucial moment of the battle was yet to come. The fate of Narnia hung in the balance, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the true test of courage, loyalty, and faith would determine whether the land would remain in eternal winter or finally see the dawn of a new spring. Would the awakened trees and the arrival of Aslan be enough to turn the tide? The answer lay in the hearts of those who fought not just for victory, but for the very soul of Narnia itself. The battlefield fell silent as the last echoes of clashing swords faded into the crisp Narnian air. Lucy Pevensey, her heart pounding against her chest, watched as the remaining forces of the White Witch's army retreated into the shadows of the forest. But victory had come at a price that weighed heavily on everyone's hearts. "Peter!" Lucy called out, running towards her elder brother who stood breathless, his sword still firmly gripped in his hand. Blood trickled down his arm from a minor wound, but his eyes held a mix of relief and sorrow. "Are you all right?" Peter managed a weak smile. "I'm fine, Lou, but we need to find the others." His voice carried the weight of responsibility that had become so familiar during their time in Narnia. Have you ever wondered how victory can feel both triumphant and hollow at the same time? Susan appeared through the crowd of celebrating Narnians, her bow slung across her back, and her face etched with concern. "Edmund's with Aslan," she announced, her voice trembling slightly. He's hurt pretty badly." The news sent a chill through Lucy's spine. She immediately reached for her cordial, the precious gift from Father Christmas that had saved so many lives during the battle. But would it be enough this time? Meanwhile, Reepicheep, despite his own injuries, maintained his gallant demeanor. "Your Majesties," he proclaimed, bowing as low as his wounded leg would allow, "the White Witch's forces are in full retreat. Trumpkin and his dwarves are ensuring they don't regroup." Mr. Tumnus limped towards them, his scarf torn and dirty, but his spirit unbroken. "Lucy," he called out, his voice filled with urgency, "Aslan requests your presence at the stone table. He says it's of utmost importance." As they made their way to the stone table, the siblings couldn't help but notice the transformation happening around them. The eternal winter that had gripped Narnia was finally breaking. Snow melted away to reveal fresh grass, and buds began to appear on long dormant trees. But what price would they have to pay for this renewal? At the stone table, they found Aslan standing guard over Edmund, who lay pale and still. The great lion's eyes held both wisdom and sadness. "Dear ones," he spoke, his voice resonating with power and compassion, "your victory is complete, but now comes a time of difficult choices." Lucy rushed to Edmund's side, uncorking her cordial with trembling hands. But Aslan gently stopped her. "Wait, daughter of Eve. There is something you must understand first. What could be more important than saving their brother's life?" The great lion explained that the deep magic that governed Narnia required balance. The White Witch's defeat had created a void that needed to be filled. Someone would need to stay behind in Narnia to help maintain the peace and guide the realm into its new age. Susan, ever practical, asked the question they were all thinking. "Do you mean one of us has to stay permanently?" Peter stepped forward, his voice steady despite his obvious emotional turmoil. "I'll do it. I'm the oldest, it's my responsibility." But Aslan shook his magnificent head. "The choice is not yours to make, son of Adam. The deep magic has already chosen." All eyes turned to Edmund, who stirred slightly. Could it be that his sacrifice during the battle was more significant than they had realized? What if his redemption story was meant to have a different ending than they had imagined? Lucy's tears fell freely as she understood the implications. Their victory over the White Witch had come at a tremendous cost, and now they faced an impossible decision. Should they use the cordial to save Edmund, knowing it would bind him forever to Narnia? Or was there another way? The siblings huddled together, their hearts heavy with the weight of the choice before them. The future of Narnia hung in the balance, but so did their family's unity. How could they possibly choose between their brother's life and their ability to stay together? As the sun began to set over the battlefield, casting long shadows across the stone table, the Pevensies faced their greatest test yet. It wasn't just about good versus evil anymore. It was about sacrifice, love, and the true meaning of family. What would you do if you had to choose between saving someone you love and keeping them close to you? The story of Narnia had always been about more than just battles and magic. It was about growing up, making difficult choices, and understanding that sometimes the greatest victories require the greatest sacrifices. As Lucy looked at her siblings' faces, she wondered if they had truly understood this until now. What choice would they make? And more importantly, What consequences would their decision have for both Narnia and their family? The answers to these questions would change everything. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The golden sunlight filtered through the trees of Narnia, casting long shadows across the faces of the four Pevensey siblings. The victory celebration had ended, but there was a heaviness in the air that even the sweet scent of talking flowers couldn't dispel. Lucy noticed it first, the way Aslan's eyes held a certain sadness as he approached them. "Dear ones," Aslan's voice rumbled softly, "come walk with me." The great lion led them away from the crowds, along a path that seemed to shimmer of the morning dew. Lucy instinctively reached for Edmund's hand, something in her heart telling her that this moment would change everything. Peter, walking tall as High King, seemed to sense it too. "Something's different, isn't it, Aslan?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility he'd grown so accustomed to bearing. "Indeed, Peter," Aslan replied, stopping in a clearing where the morning light created a natural spotlight. "You and Susan have learned all you can from Narnia. You have grown into the leaders you were meant to become." Susan's sharp intake of breath broke the momentary silence. "What do you mean, Aslan?" But in her heart, she already knew. The practical sister had always been quick to understand, even when the truth was difficult to accept. "You mean they can't come back?" Edmund's voice cracked slightly, his hand tightening around Lucy's. The younger brother had changed so much from his first visit to Narnia, and now he faced another profound change. Aslan's eyes were filled with both love and sorrow as he explained, "Peter and Susan have grown too old for Narnia. Their time of visiting this world has come to an end. They must now apply what they've learned in their own world." Lucy couldn't hold back her tears. "That's not fair. We're family. We're supposed to stay together." Her words echoed the sentiment in all their hearts. But even as she spoke them, she understood the necessity of this change. Peter, showing the wisdom that had made him High King, placed a gentle hand on Lucy's shoulder. "Lou, remember what Mr. Tumnus told you about change. How it's like the seasons, necessary even when it's difficult." The mention of their old friend brought both smiles and tears. Susan, ever practical even in emotional moments, asked, "Will we remember? Will we forget Narnia, forget everything we've learned?" "The memories will stay with you," Aslan assured them, "though they may feel more like dreams in your world. But the lessons, the courage, the wisdom, the love, those will remain as real as ever." Edmund, who had learned perhaps the most valuable lessons in Narnia, spoke up. "Like how Reepicheep taught us that size doesn't determine worth, or how Trumpkin showed us that loyalty doesn't always wear a crown." "Precisely," Aslan nodded. "And like the White Witch taught us that power without love leads to destruction." The siblings stood together, each lost in their own memories of their adventures. How many times had they walked these forests? How many battles had they fought? How many friendships had they forged? But what about Lucy and Edmund? Susan asked, always concerned for her younger siblings. "Their time in Narnia is not yet complete," Aslan explained. "They still have more to learn, more adventures to experience." Peter, showing the leadership that had defined his time as High King, straightened his shoulders. "Then we must make this farewell count," he declared. "We must ensure that everything we've learned, everything we've become, continues to matter in our world." The next few hours were filled with tearful goodbyes to their Narnian friends. Mr. Tumnus held Lucy extra long, whispering words of comfort. Reepicheep bowed low to Peter, his small sword raised in final salute. Trumpkin, trying to hide his emotions, gruffly promised to look after the younger ones. As the moment of departure drew near, Aslan gathered them once more. "Remember, dear ones, once a king or queen of Narnia, always a king or queen. Though you may not return, Peter and Susan, you carry Narnia in your hearts." Lucy, still struggling with the reality of the situation, asked the question that burned in all their hearts. "But how will we go on without each other in Narnia?" Aslan's response was gentle but firm. "By remembering that love transcends all worlds, all boundaries. Your bond as siblings, strengthened by your time here, will only grow stronger as you face this new challenge." The final moments were upon them. Peter and Susan took one last look at the land they had helped rule, at the friends they had made, at the world that had shaped them into who they had become. The air seemed to shimmer with magic and memory. "Ready?" Peter asked, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Susan nodded, reaching for his hand. "Ready. Lucy, Edmund, take care of each other, and take care of Narnia for us." As they prepared to step through the doorway that would take them home, Aslan's voice carried one final message. "Remember, children, the greatest adventures often come disguised as endings. This is not goodbye forever, it is simply goodbye for now." And with that, Peter and Susan Pevensey took their final steps in Narnia, leaving behind a legacy of courage, wisdom, and love that would echo through both worlds forever. The great hall of Cair Paravel stood silent as Edmund Pevensey gazed out of its crystalline windows, his reflection showing a face that had grown wise beyond its years. Gone was the sullen boy who had once betrayed his siblings for Turkish delight. In his place stood a young man whose experiences had carved wisdom into his very being. "Do you ever think about that day?" Lucy's soft voice broke through his contemplation as she joined him at the window. Edmund knew exactly which day she meant, the day of his redemption, when Aslan had sacrificed himself on the stone table. "Every day, Lou," Edmund replied, his voice carrying the weight of memories. "It's funny how our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest lessons, isn't it?" Peter and Susan entered the hall, their faces bearing concerned expressions. News had arrived from the western woods of unrest among some of the creatures who remembered the White Witch's reign. Some were whispering of her return, despite her defeat years ago. "What do you think we should do?" Peter asked, naturally turning to Edmund. It was a marked change from their earlier days when Peter would have simply charged ahead with his own plans. Edmund turned from the window, his eyes showing a depth of understanding that made even Susan pause. "We've all learned that fear can make people, and creatures, do terrible things. I should know," he smiled ruefully. "But we've also learned that understanding and forgiveness are more powerful than any magic. But how can we make them see that?" Susan questioned, ever practical. "They're scared, and scared beings don't always listen to reason." Edmund walked to the center of the hall, where a shaft of sunlight illuminated the marble floor. "Remember what Mr. Tumnus told us about how the witch's winter felt endless, how hope seemed impossible?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "But spring came, didn't it? And not just because Aslan defeated her, but because Narnians chose to believe in something better." Reepicheep, who had been quietly listening from his perch on a nearby chair, stood tall. "Your Majesty speaks with the wisdom of one who has seen both darkness and light," the noble mouse declared. "That's exactly it," Reepicheep, Edmund said, needing to address the valiant mouse at eye level. "We all have darkness and light within us. The trick isn't to pretend the darkness doesn't exist, but to understand it so we can choose the light." Lucy's eyes widened with understanding. Like how Aslan didn't just defeat the witch with force, but with deeper magic from before the dawn of time. Precisely, Edmund smiled at his younger sister. "We need to show these creatures that their fears are understood, but that there's a better way forward. Remember how Trumpkin didn't believe in us at first, but it wasn't our titles that convinced him, it was our actions." Peter stepped forward, placing a hand on Edmund's shoulder. "What do you suggest then, brother?" "Let's go to them," Edmund proposed. "Not with swords drawn or crowns gleaming, but as we are. Let them see that we understand their fears because we face them ourselves. Let them see that even a traitor can become a king when given the chance to choose differently." Susan's practical nature emerged again. "But what if they don't listen? What if they're too afraid?" Edmund's response came with a quiet confidence that only experience could bring. "Then we show them what Aslan showed me, that love is stronger than fear, that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, and that it's never too late to choose a different path." The siblings exchanged glances, remembering their own journeys from children hiding from war in a professor's house to kings and queens of Narnia. Each had their own story of growth and change, but perhaps none so dramatic as Edmund's. "You know," Lucy said thoughtfully, I think this is exactly why Aslan let us stay in Narnia. Not just to rule, but to show others what we'd learned. Edmund nodded, his face illuminated by the strengthening sunlight. Every story matters, Lou. Every choice counts. Even the painful ones, especially the painful ones, can teach us something valuable. As they began to plan their journey to the western woods, Edmund's wisdom continued to guide them. He had learned that true courage wasn't about never being afraid, but about facing those fears with understanding and compassion. His past mistakes had become a bridge to help others find their way out of darkness. The great hall of Caer Paravel no longer felt silent, but filled with purpose. As they prepared for their mission, Edmund's final words echoed through the chamber. Remember, we're not just bringing them a message of hope, we're bringing them proof that hope works. That's something even the deepest winter can't freeze. The gentle morning light filtered through the dense Narnian forest as Lucy Pevensey stood alone at the edge of a clearing. Her heart was heavy with the weight of recent events, yet her faith remained unshaken. While others had begun to doubt, she could still feel Aslan's presence as clearly as the warmth of the sun on her face. "Lucy." Susan's voice called out from behind her. "What are you doing out here all alone? It's not safe." Lucy turned to face her sister, noting the worry lines that had formed on Susan's usually composed face. "I'm not alone," Lucy replied simply. "Aslan is here. Can't you feel it?" Susan's expression softened with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Lucy, I know you want to believe that, but we haven't seen him since." "Since doesn't matter," Edmund interrupted, joining his sisters. His face bore the wisdom of someone who had learned life's hardest lessons firsthand. "Lucy's always been right about these things, Susan. Remember when she first found Narnia? None of us believed her then either." Peter emerged from the trees, followed by Trumpkin and Reepicheep. The noble mouse warrior's tail twitched with anticipation as he surveyed the gathering. "Your Majesty," he addressed Lucy with his characteristic formality, "I must concur with Queen Lucy. There is something different in the air today." Lucy smiled gratefully at Reepicheep, remembering how Mr. Tumnus once described Narnia's magic as being in the air. How different things had been then, when she first stepped through the wardrobe and met the kind-hearted faun. Now, with the White Witch's followers gaining strength once again, they needed Aslan more than ever. "But how can we be sure?" Trumpkin asked, his gruff voice betraying his own struggle with faith. "The White Witch's power grows stronger each day. Even the trees whisper of her influence spreading." Lucy knelt beside the dwarf, her young face showing wisdom beyond her years. "Do you remember what Edmund told us about his time with the White Witch?" she asked, glancing at her brother, who nodded encouragingly. "He said her power seemed absolute, unbeatable. But it wasn't, was it?" Edmund stepped forward, his voice steady. "No, it wasn't. And do you know why?" He looked around at their small group. "Because Aslan's power comes from something deeper than magic. It comes from love, from faith, from the very essence of Narnia itself." As if in response to Edmund's words, a warm breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of summer roses, a scent that had been absent during the White Witch's eternal winter. Lucy closed her eyes, drinking in the familiar fragrance. "But what if we're wrong?" Susan whispered, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at them all. "What if this time is different?" Peter, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "I've been thinking about something Mr. Tumnus once told Lucy," he said, drawing everyone's attention. "He said that Narnia isn't just a place, it's a promise. And who made that promise?" "Aslan," Lucy answered without hesitation. "He promised that he would never abandon Narnia or its people." Reepicheep drew his tiny sword, holding it aloft. "Then that is all we need to know. Faith, my friends, is not about seeing the entire path ahead. It's about taking the next step, even when the path seems dark." As they stood there, Lucy felt a familiar warmth in her heart, the same feeling she'd had when she first discovered the lamppost in the snowy woods. She understood now why Aslan had chosen her to find Narnia first. It wasn't because she was special or braver than the others. It was because she had never learned to stop believing in the impossible. The White Witch's power comes from fear, Lucy said, her voice growing stronger. She wants us to doubt, to question everything we know to be true. But that's exactly why we must hold onto our faith more strongly than ever. Edmund placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. Lucy's right. Remember how the witch turned everything to stone. But what she never understood was that stone could be brought back to life, if you believe strongly enough. The group fell silent, contemplating Lucy's words. Even Trumpkin, despite his natural skepticism, seemed moved. The morning light grew stronger, and somewhere in the distance they heard the call of a thrush, one of the talking birds of Narnia. So what do we do now? Susan asked, but her voice had lost its earlier doubt. Lucy stood up, her face illuminated with inner certainty. We do what Aslan would want us to do. We keep believing, we keep fighting, and most importantly, we keep helping others believe too. Peter drew his sword, its blade catching the sunlight. Then that's what we'll do. Together. As they gathered their weapons and prepared to continue their journey, Lucy caught a glimpse of something golden moving through the trees. Was it just the morning sun or something more? She smiled, knowing that some questions didn't need answers. Faith, after all, wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trusting that the answers would come when they were needed most. And somewhere, in the heart of Narnia, a lion's roar echoed through the mountains, though only those who truly believed could hear it. Lucy sat by the ancient stone table, her fingers tracing the worn engravings that told stories of old Narnia. Something felt different today. The air seemed thinner, the colors less vibrant, and even the whispers of the trees had grown fainter. She looked up at her siblings, who were gathered around her, and saw the same concern reflected in their eyes. "Do you feel it too?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter nodded slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, a gesture that had become more habit than necessity. "The magic," Susan said, her practical nature giving way to a hint of sadness. "It's not as strong as it used to be." She reached out to touch a nearby tree, one that had danced for them countless times before, but its branches remained still. Edmund, who had been unusually quiet, stepped forward. "Remember when we first came to Narnia? Everything seemed to pulse with magic. Even the air we breathed felt different." His words carried the weight of someone who had experienced both the darkness and light of this magical realm. Mr. Tumnus appeared from behind a cluster of trees, his hooves making less noise than usual on the forest floor. "The veil between the worlds grows thinner," he explained, his voice carrying a mixture of wisdom and melancholy. "Even the youngest dryads can sense it." The news spread through their small gathering like an autumn breeze. Reepicheep, ever the valiant warrior, stood tall despite his small stature. But surely Aslan wouldn't allow Narnia to simply fade. His whiskers twitched with concern, but his voice remained steady. "Perhaps," Trumpkin mused, "this is part of Aslan's plan. He once told us that nothing lasts forever in its current form." The dwarf's words, though meant to comfort, only heightened the sense of impending change. Lucy remembered her last conversation with Aslan, how his golden mane had seemed slightly less bright, his roar a touch softer. Had she known then what was coming? Had there been signs all along that they had chosen to ignore? The White Witch's old castle, now nothing more than ruins in the distance, seemed to serve as a reminder that all things must change. Even the evil that had once threatened to destroy Narnia had transformed into nothing more than a cautionary tale told to young fauns and dryads. Peter took a deep breath, his role as High King prompting him to provide strength when others faltered. "Perhaps we're not losing the magic," he suggested, "but rather its changing form. Remember what Aslan always says about faith." Susan, who had grown more skeptical over the years, found herself nodding. "That it's strongest when we can't see what we believe in," she finished, a small smile playing on her lips. The group fell into contemplative silence, broken only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the shores of the eastern sea. Each of them could feel it, the subtle shift in the fabric of their beloved Narnia. But what did it mean for their future, for their connection to this magical realm. Edmund, who had experienced more than most the transformative power of Narnia, spoke up. "Maybe the magic isn't fading at all," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's preparing us for something new. After all, isn't that what Narnia has always been about? Teaching us to see magic in places we least expect it." Lucy felt a warm tear roll down her cheek as she listened to her brother's words. She remembered the first time she stepped through the wardrobe, how the impossible had become possible in an instant. "Do you think," she asked, her voice trembling slightly, "we'll ever stop being able to come back?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, heavy with unspoken fears and hopes. Reepicheep, ever the optimist, raised his sword in a gesture of defiance against despair. "My queen," he said with characteristic gallantry, "as long as Narnia lives in our hearts, we are never truly away from it." As if in response to the mouse's words, a gentle breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of lion's breath. The Pevensies exchanged glances, remembering all the times Aslan had appeared just when they needed him most. Would he appear now to explain these changes? Or was learning to navigate this uncertainty part of their continuing journey? The magic might be changing, but the lessons of Narnia, courage, faith, love, and sacrifice, remained as strong as ever. As the sun began to set over the eastern sea, casting long shadows across the land they had come to love so deeply, each of them silently wondered what new adventure awaited them in this changing Narnia, and perhaps most importantly, were they ready to face it with the same courage they had shown in all their previous trials? The answer, they would soon discover, lay not in the fading magic around them, but in the growing strength within their hearts. A different kind of magic altogether, one that even the thinning veil between worlds couldn't diminish. Lucy sat quietly by the window of their London home, her fingers tracing patterns on the foggy glass as rain trickled down outside. The memory of their last adventure in Narnia still felt fresh, yet somehow distant, like a dream slowly fading with the morning light. She could feel it. The magic that had once flowed so freely between their worlds was growing thinner, more fragile with each passing day. "Do you feel it too?" Edmund's voice broke through her thoughts as he settled beside her. His face, once marked by betrayal and redemption, now carried the wisdom of someone who had lived 2 lives. "The way Narnia seems further away." Peter and Susan joined them, drawn by the conversation. The 4 siblings, who had once ruled as kings and queens of Narnia, now sat huddled together like ordinary children sharing a secret. But they were far from ordinary, weren't they? How many children could say they had ridden alongside a talking lion and all fought battles against forces of darkness? "I had a dream last night," Susan confessed, her usually practical demeanor softening. "I saw Aslan, but his voice was so faint. He said something about endings and beginnings, but I couldn't quite make it out." Her words hung heavy in the air, leaving them all to wonder, was this truly the end of their Narnian adventures? Lucy remembered Mr. Tumnus's words from their first meeting, how he had spoken of Narnia's magic with such wonder and fear. "Do you remember what Mr. Tumnus told us about magic?" she asked, turning to her siblings. "How it's not just about grand gestures and battles, but about the small moments that change us forever." The memory of Reepicheep's unwavering courage flooded their thoughts. The noble mouse warrior had taught them that bravery wasn't about size or strength, but about the heart's conviction. "I wonder what Reepicheep would say if he could see us now," Edmund mused. "Probably something about facing forward with honor, even when the path ahead seems unclear." Peter, who had always carried the weight of leadership, spoke next. "Perhaps this is what Aslan meant when he said we would learn to find him in our own world. Remember what he told us about knowing him by another name here?" The question sparked a deeper conversation about their experiences with Trumpkin the dwarf, who had initially doubted their stories but came to believe through witnessing their actions. Wasn't that how faith worked? Through small steps and gradual understanding. As they talked, memories of their battles against the White Witch seemed to take on new meaning. Jadis had represented more than just an enemy. She had been a test of their character, their unity, and their belief in something greater than themselves. How many times in their ordinary lives would they need to draw upon those same qualities? But what if we forget? Lucy's voice trembled slightly. What if the magic fades so much that we can't remember Narnia at all? It was a fear they all shared, but hadn't dared to voice until now. Susan reached out and took her sister's hand. I don't think we can ever truly forget, Lou. The magic might change, but what it taught us, what Aslan taught us, that's part of who we are now. The rain outside began to ease, and a weak ray of sunlight broke through the clouds. Edmund stood and walked to the window, his reflection overlapping with the brightening sky. Maybe that's what this is all about, he said thoughtfully. Not just having adventures in Narnia, but bringing what we learned there into our world. Peter nodded, remembering his own journey from uncertain boy to High King and back again. Aslan once told me that the greatest battles are fought within ourselves. Perhaps losing the magic is just another kind of battle, one where we have to choose to keep believing even when we can't see through the wardrobe anymore. As the siblings continued their conversation, they began to understand that while the physical connection to Narnia might be fading, its influence on their lives remained as strong as ever. Every lesson learned, every friendship forged, every challenge overcome had shaped them into who they were meant to become. But questions still lingered in their minds. How would they maintain their faith in magic in a world that often seemed devoid of it? Could they hold on to the wisdom of Narnia while growing up in London? And most importantly, would there ever be a way back? Or was this truly their last farewell to the magical realm that had changed their lives forever? The answers wouldn't come easily, but as they sat together, sharing memories and hopes, they realized that perhaps the greatest magic of all was not in the ability to travel between worlds, but in the transformation that had occurred within their own hearts. And that was something that could never truly fade away.